associated with swaps and security-based swaps. In addition, today we plan to discuss issues related to the real-time reporting of swaps and security-based swap trades. We have a very full agenda that is designed to focus the discussion on what we believe are very pertinent issues. The discussion today will be divided into 4 panels. I'd like to thank all of our distinguished group of panelists for agreeing to participate and taking time out of their busy schedules to discuss these important subjects. I'd also like to thank the staffs of the SEC and the CFTC for their hard work in planning today's roundtable. This roundtable is the second one to be conducted, the first focused on issues related to governance and conflict of interest in the clearing and listing of swaps. In addition, we have another tomorrow related to swap execution facilities. That earlier roundtable and the ones today and tomorrow illustrate the collaborative relationship that the staffs of the 2 agencies have developed in our efforts to implement the various provisions of the Dodd-Frank Act. As you all know, the Dodd-Frank Act brings the over-the-counter derivatives under comprehensive regulation. Standardized derivatives will be traded on transparent trading platforms and cleared by regulated central counterparties. This will increase transparency as information on swaps and security-based swaps trades will be available to regulatory authorities and transaction data will be available to the public on a real-time basis. The overarching goal is to reduce the overall risk in our economy, which will greatly benefit the American public. Key elements of the Dodd-Frank Act include the reporting of swaps and security-based swaps to a registered entity, the establishment of swap and security-based swap data repositories to accept data on swap trades, and procedures for real-time reporting of key data on executed swaps and security-based swaps. The purpose of this roundtable today is to hear the opinions and advice of persons with diverse interests, experience, and points of view on these various aspects of the legislation. The CFTC and SEC staffs look forward to hearing the thoughts and analyses of those on the panels today. This roundtable should assist both of our staffs in implementing the Dodd-Frank Act. For the record, I'd like to note that all statements and opinions that may be expressed and all questions asked by CFTC staff are those of CFTC staff and do not represent the views of any commissioner or the commission collectively. And before I turn it over to my colleague Robert Cook, I need to note some housekeeping items. I want to point out that this is not the only opportunity for interested parties to have input on these issues. Both the CFTC and SEC have mailboxes into which anyone can submit comments and supporting materials. These comments will be read by staff and will help us get diverse input with respect not only to the specific rulemakings we will be addressing today, but all the rulemakings related to implementation of Dodd-Frank Act. Everybody should know that the meeting today is being recorded. The microphones are in front of you. Please press the button and you'll see the red light. That means you can talk and speak directly into the mic. When you finish, please press the button to turn off the microphone. And we ask that you please refrain from putting any BlackBerries near the mic or cell phones near the microphones, as they've been known to cause interference with our system. And now I'd like to invite some comments from my colleague Robert Cook.
Thank you, Rick, and good morning. I'm Robert Cook. I'm the Director of the Division of Trading and Markets at the SEC. I'd just like to very briefly echo some of the comments that Rick just made. First, to thank the staff of the CFTC for their hard work in preparing for this panel and hosting it, and for the collaboration and cooperation that you've shown to our staff at the SEC, and also thanks to the staff of the SEC for their work in helping to put together this panel. And we'll look forward to hosting you over at the SEC tomorrow for the panel on CEFs. Secondly, I'd like to thank the panelists for joining us today. And again, as Rick mentioned, your insights and contributions to this discussion will be very important to us as we seek to implement the provisions of the Dodd-Frank Act. The topic today it can be technical, but I think we'd all recognize it as extremely important to fulfilling some of the core goals of the Dodd-Frank Act, including enhancing transparency, creating better market efficiency and liquidity, promoting standardization, reducing systemic risk, and enhancing the ability of regulators to monitor and regulate the currently OTC derivatives markets. So with that in mind, I'd like to also echo Rick's comments that this is not the only opportunity for anyone to participate and offer their comments in this dialogue. The mailboxes that Rick mentioned are very useful to us to get comments from people from various different backgrounds on these issues, and the rules that we will adopt under the Dodd-Frank Act will first be proposed for public comment, and we strongly encourage everyone who has interest to submit their comments on those rules, and we will look forward to receiving them, and we'll take those comments very seriously. And then finally, I'd like to make the same hedge clause that statement that Rick just made, which is that any comments, questions, lines of inquiry that you may hear from SEC staff today really reflect their own views, not those of the SEC, any of the individual commissioners on the SEC, or their colleagues on the SEC staff. So with that, I'll hand it back to Rick.
Thanks, Robert. Before we start the first panel, I'd like to go through the agenda. As I mentioned, we have scheduled 4 panels today. The first panel is going to discuss swap data repository functions and responsibilities, and it will run from 9 o'clock to 10:45. The second panel concerns the mechanics of reporting data on swaps, which will go from 11 to 12:45. Our third panel today concerns real-time reporting and the data elements to be disseminated, and that will go from 1:45 to 3:30. And lastly, our fourth panel concerns the effect of transparency and liquidity and the block trade exception, and that will run from 3:45 to 5:30, and we plan to conclude the roundtable at 5:30 p.m. I'll be the designated timekeeper, and we'll try to make sure that we stay on time today. So I'd like to get started with the first panel. As I noted, Panel 1 will focus on registration functions and responsibilities of swap data repositories. Some of the topics we want to discuss today on this panel include the scope of a swap data repository's core repository functions, any other regulatory functions which SDR should perform with respect to data in their possession, the mechanics of regulators' access to this data, both for foreign regulators and domestic regulators, and any jurisdictional and information sharing issues which might arise around foreign swap data repositories. To begin the discussion, I'd first like to go around the table and have all the panelists introduce themselves and just let us know where they're from. So.
Thanks, Rick. My name is Jeff Gooch from MarketServe. We're an electronic trade confirmation provider for OTC derivatives. I'm Chief Executive.
My name is Chester Spatt. I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. From 2004 to 2007, I also happen to serve as the SEC's chief economist. I'm currently a member of the Shadow Financial Regulatory Committee that meets quarterly.
Bruce Tupper, Intercontinental Exchange, or ICE. I manage the ICE eConfirm trade repository for commodities and energies.
Stuart Macbeth from DTCC. I'm the General Manager of DTCC's Trade Information Warehouse.
Good morning. My name is Sebastian Peugeot. I work in the CFTC's Division of Market Oversight.
Hello, I'm Susan Nathan. I'm a Senior Special Counsel in the CFTC Division of Market Oversight.
Good morning. My name is Joanne Swindler. I'm in the Division of Trading and Markets at the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Hello, my name is Raf Pritchard. I'm the head of Trioptima North America. We provide portfolio compression, exposure management, and interest rate trade repository to the OTC swap market.
Hello, my name is Jiro Kocha. I'm the CEO, co-founder of Reval. We provide a web-based solution for corporate end users and banks using over-the-counter derivatives.
Good morning. I'm Mark Dixon with Evolution Markets. We are an over-the-counter derivatives broker.
Good morning. I'm Athanasios Diplas. I'm from the global credit trading side of the business, and I'm in charge. I'm the global head of the systemic risk management. I also co-chair the credit steering committee under ISDA.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're going to be asking some questions from the SEC and CFTC staff, and we would like to give everyone an opportunity who wants to respond to a particular question a chance to give us their opinions, and if it goes on too long, I may be forced to try to shorten the response so that we can go through all the topics we want to discuss today. And I guess we'll kick it off with the first question from SEC.
Thank you, Rick. Let me start off and just ask you if you could address a fairly broad question, but one very important to our responsibilities. In your views, what are the best ways to address the core duties of SDRs? And if you could, in particular, focus on the confirmation obligation. Thank you.
So, it's Stuart Macbeth from DTCC. In terms of core duties, clearly the reporting duty is key. To do that, though, there's a series of underlying requirements needed, including data, particularly trade data, trade event data, that are held as positions, and other data attributes associated with those positions that can be reported externally, both to regulators, based on their regulatory ambit, and also to the public at a level of aggregation and anonymity. In terms of structure to provide that, various levels of infrastructure would be required, including practices around business continuity, strong governance over the offering, audit and compliance procedures. So the function as a whole primarily focused on reporting, but with supporting infrastructure to ensure that reporting is of high quality and appropriate.
Anyone else?
I'd like to echo what Stuart just said, but also add that I think it's not just about the data that the SDR holds, it's what to do with that data. So looking at future risks through analyzing current valuations, whether that's theoretical valuations or credit-adjusted valuations to liquidate the positions, making sure the SDR is flexible to add new products pretty quickly, on top of all the security and redundancy, disaster recovery that should also be required. So I think it's really not just thinking about what to do with current and past trades, but how to grow with the market, because I think our duty is to make sure that the markets continue to perform and grow along with complying with the regulations.
Okay, if I could add to that, I think this topic of confirmation and SDRs comes up quite a lot in discussions. It's probably worth backing up a moment to say why are we talking about the two things at the same time. Clearly, to fulfill the roles that Stuart and Giro have commented on, SDRs need a source of accurate data that's complete, agreed on by market participants, and timely. And confirmations is a good source of supplying that, in the sense you have a transaction that's electronic, both parties have agreed, you have all the legal details, most people are motivated to complete that as quickly as possible, and really confirmations is the baseline for something that feeds SDRs, feeds CCPs, feeds a lot of transparency requirements. So it's a very important part of the end game structure, I think, in terms of the OTC markets. Whether you call that an SDR function, whether you call it a CEF function, whether you call it something else, I'm not sure it's that important, frankly. I think you have to call it something, and that's probably something for the commissions to decide on the right naming. But I think the confirmations themselves have an important part of the ecosystem if this whole reform is going to be successful in terms of making sure we get high quality data out to the right people.
One particular issue with respect to the composition of data that I think it's particularly important to flag is the arrangements for posting collateral and how collateral evolves, which might vary quite a lot. Because ultimately the assessment of credit exposures, and obviously it's credit kinds of issues and systemic risks that are motivating much of the reform, the assessment of that depends on the fine detail of the contract. So I think it's very important that that information be specifically captured and be readily available to the regulators. That was clearly a crucial problem several years ago.
I think if I can follow up on that point, I think we're discussing some of the core functions of the data repositories, and that is basically captured along the confirm. But then we have a lot of these ancillary functions that I think are important. Now, collateral in particular is, I think, problematic to be associated currently as we stand with a specific repository, because those are organized on an asset class basis, while collateral is actually collected on a legal entity basis most of the time, of several different entities together that might have actually collateral cross-netting agreements, etc. So I think a single repository will not be able to individually fulfill that function, but that information has to be obviously accurate to let the regulators go to multiple ones, sometimes collect that, but also they have to go individually to the specific firms that participate to get the full picture.
Are you saying that the SDR would have to go to the individual
No,
firms?
a
or the
regulator will have to actually get that systemic risk picture, basically. But the other thing that is important with repositories, and I think it varies by asset class, and is that they provide other functions that are perhaps not necessarily demanded by the legislation, but are actually equally important. So asset class such as credit, they contain right now information that help us actually deal with things like credit events, be able to actually settle the contracts in case there is a bankruptcy, etc. So a lot of that information might not be mandated by the legislation, but at the same time is very important in the design of the repository. The second thing that is fundamental from our perspective as a market participant, and I think have similar incentives to what regulators have, is to have a single repository per asset class so that actually all that information can be contained in one place and we don't have actually information falling through the gaps. Part of the problem in the past has been that information was fragmented and that caused the extreme problems.
Yeah, this is Raf from Dropto. I'd agree with both of those points there. I think Chester mentioned the systemic risk monitoring point, and really the key is to make sure that a repository has a comprehensive view of all the swap outstanding live contracts. And there's a broad landscape there. Our exposure management service sees 6 million trades across many asset classes, credit, equity, FX, commodity, etc. And it's many different instrument types within that, simple high volume vanilla trades, forwards and swaps, but also complex trades, exotics and structures. And what's really important for a repository is that it has comprehensive coverage. It captures the whole universe of trades out there, and uniquely, it doesn't double count anything. So the approach taken should really focus on that goal, because that's where the systemic risk monitoring benefit can be best realized.
Excuse me, I'd like to follow up on a few things that have been said here, because it seems like we're drawing, there's a little bit of a distinction between the data that people agree should be in it in order for the repository to be of use, and the functions, and I'd like to explore this a little bit more, the ones that you think the SDRs must perform with respect to that data, and that no one else in the market is going to be in a position to perform. If you could just give us a little bit more of a sense of, assuming that the position data in there and the valuation data is there and all that information gets there, is there something that the SDR has to do with respect to that data, or is it optional? Somebody has to do it, but not necessarily the SDR.
So the key thing the SDR has is this potential completeness of data. So, and it's, you know, others have already commented on this, but this fragmentation point is key. The current environment that we work in and we live in, the information is there. It is available to regulators. The problem is an aggregation and consolidation one. And the repositories really are going to provide is the solution to that problem. And that in reality is the key differentiator for repositories. Now, the thing that makes hard is the structural elements of how then you put that kind of model in place, because there's potentially, and there's a risk here that we blend into the next panel to some extent, that different actors and different service providers start overlapping in some of their roles, or that there's many service providers providing an SDR function, and then the aggregation responsibility falls on a commission to aggregate, and then in the public domain it's potentially impossible to aggregate. So things like the net open interest in certain contracts can only be determined by a level of detail which won't be available to the public. The counterparties won't be disclosed to the public, therefore the net position won't be correctly able to be netted. And we can see that in our data, at DTCC, even looking at some of the information across clearers. If you try and aggregate that, some of our netting actually produces lower numbers than they might publish. So the true net open interest in the market, some of the trading activity that goes on in the market is only really visible from this single vantage point of a repository in an unfragmented mode. So that to my mind is the big differentiator about a repository. We agree. There were some comments made in effect about different consumers. People talked about systemic risk and the value of collateral. And information about where collateral is held. That's clear. The asset class specialism of repositories as a provider is very useful because each contract form and potentially some of the additional processing provided does have its own peculiarities. It's very difficult, I think, to play across everything in the whole space successfully and move at the pace that the market does. From a provider perspective, concentrating in a market and delivering to that market, is a good model. In terms of, we've talked a little bit about additional services there. Thanasis mentioned those. So from a DTCC perspective, that's very important to us. We do offer some additional services. So we take in confirmed trades. Jeff Gooch mentioned that, but from there we do maintain a record, and we actually perform lifecycle event processing on that records to update things for succession events. So if you imagine the underlying corporates, they go through mergers, acquisitions, they restructure. We maintain that so that if a regulator wants an actual position and understanding in terms of a market exposure in the market today, they can get that readily. So confirmations alone, confirmation is the best source, but confirmation alone isn't all a repository will need. It will need some capability to maintain those contract records thereafter. And the market participants themselves enjoy that centralized database. That was the history of DTCC's trade information repository. It really was about mitigating ops risk and producing efficiencies by being a central database. The world before was a very confused bilateral reconciliation world. There was multiple bilateral reconciliation points that happened, and the value proposition of the warehouse was really to be a central database so that each participant could go and reconcile to that record and not have to deal with the bilateral complexity. So I think it has been a kind of a powerful model, and it is a well-proven, model. But it's interesting, as we go through this reforms, there are some threats again with the other, participants that are becoming actors in this space, and clearly, there's some of the requirements currently that we've enjoyed some ability to grow a business over a period, but whether there are threats from things like CCPs registering as SDRs and providing some of the same data that could be at the expense of ultimately the public interest, where that net position needs to be presented, is some of the issues that in implementing regulation we're going to have to try and manage.
Bruce Tupper with ICE eConfirm. Just to follow on, I think it's important we take a step back and just look at within Dodd-Frank the duties of an SDR, and just to paraphrase those, they are to accept data, to confirm, maintain the data, and provide the Commission with access. And the Commission would establish automated reports, monitoring, screening, and analyzing data. Just speaking for energies and commodities, we've operated this service for 8 years, and our warehouse holds 5.1 million trades. One of the biggest challenges, I believe, to accomplishing the analyzing and position reporting and these ancillary services is first to build a system that has the connectivity to all the market participants. When you look at energies, it's a very diverse group of participants. It's made up of banks, energy companies, producers, hedge funds. So there was a real challenge when we set out to build the warehouse for energies, was to figure a way how to connect all these people into one central repository. That really is going to be key, and working with the Commission to create the rules around people's access to that system, how they should connect, just pretty much the rule book to an SDR. I believe once that's accomplished and the industry understands what they need to do, the fallout of that will be a very robust database that the commission then could put these ancillary services on, what were mentioned by other panel members. You know, you can margin, you can figure out collateral, but until you kind of accomplish step one, which is the first part of the duties, you're not really going to achieve your goal. I would say working with the commission is that there's a lot of components that we were able to achieve or build with the industry. Especially with energies, it's very diverse, as I mentioned. So I think having, working with the numerous standards bodies, there's the BN1, there's EEI in energies, there's LEAP, which is for physical oil. You really need to engage each of these standards bodies to really get them on board, so that the industry would accept that SDR. So, for example, if you're after gaining oil trade data, you're going to want to work and standardize all those terms so that all of the, let's just say, non-large volume participants would accept that and then submit you the data. Once you have the confirmed trade data in, and then, as mentioned earlier, life cycle events is very important. To date, our experience has been our customers haven't really had a demand in energies for life cycle events. I would really attribute that to probably OTC clearing or clearing of swaps. So once that service came to market, there was a really diminished amount of, I'd say, open interest out there, or risk, real concern. A lot of those let's say, risky participants will move quickly into the clearinghouse. So what you were really left with was this kind of pool of trades where it was either large dealers or you had producers and they were helping them hedge, right? Which and a lot of those trades really weren't candidates for clearing because of the cost of collateral to post. Where the producers are really just, as many people probably know, just pretty much their production to be produced is really the collateral. So it's not a cash collateral, so to speak. So we work very closely with a lot of these smaller producers to build functionality where they're not very technically savvy to help them come onto the system and then aggregate all of them. So I guess in summary, there's a lot of building blocks which I think are really well described in the bill, in Dodd-Frank. There describes the duties, and then once that's accomplished, the Section 5 really starts speaking about the reports and analyzing the data. I think we're really well positioned to do that. But I think really the goal is really to establish that first part. Thank you.
I would think, we focused a lot of the discussion, obviously, on the more electronically confirmed trades, which is important, and obviously we would love all the trades to be such, but there's also trades that are not electronically confirmed, and legacy trades, etc., trades with small counterparties, and I think we need to also think, as we design the framework, that we create a framework that can accommodate both. One of those things, this kind of the approach we took, for example, on the credit side, where we have the kind of the gold records, which is basically the electronically confirmed trades, but at the same time we have created the concept of the copper records, which is basically a more distilled set of information, which has been agreed with the regulators. We create a few different buckets of information within different trades can fall in, and then we have a process by which we can agree what is the rudimentary information that needs to be transmitted to the regulators. And I think that's important that that kind of concept is expanded, and that way it can also allow for new products to come on board, and it also it gives the time to the providers to develop basically the electronic confirms as needed, etc.
I'll pick up on that. I think that's a very good point, Thanasis. There is a proportion of trades out there that are more complex, legacy, exotic for whatever reason, are not electronically confirmed. And I think if we bear in mind the comprehensiveness goal of the repository, then it's really key to go to the source of the trades, and that's the parties themselves, that they should submit the trades direct to the repository rather than some intermediary, very successful electronic confirmation or whatever platform. But the parties themselves have a strong interest in doing their own risk management across their entire portfolios, and thus they've got the best view of these trades and the best place to be the source of it for repositories.
So I'd like to follow up on the last couple. This is Chester Spatt. I'd like to follow up on the last couple of remarks. I think it's very important to what data repositories would be doing, that their sphere is potentially beyond cleared standardized trades, and I think the last couple of comments really highlight that issue and what some of the crucial nuances there. One shouldn't think of this as in terms of some equivalence between data repositories and clearing. It seems to me the scope for data repositories is broader. And again, if you think back to the, I think we sometimes kind of lose sight of what some of the particular issues were that kind of motivated kind of where we are now. And I'm not suggesting that we be kind of narrowly linked to the details of what happened a few years ago, but we also ought not to forget what happened a few years ago. But situations like the types of derivative contracts that AIG entered into, these are probably not. In many cases, these would not have been standardized. These would have not been sufficiently standardized. These probably would not have been clear. These probably would not have been cleared kinds of contracts. The parties that were on the other side of these trades were interested in customized exposures. The issues of understanding systemic risks are intimately linked to those types of instruments as well as the instruments that can be offset. The systemic risk issues weren't really as directly associated with contracts that were being netted. And I think that that point I think is understood. But obviously there's trade-offs with respect to the scope for clearing, and I'm not advocating universal clearing. But I do think the data repository issue, the margin for the use of the repositories, is much broader than with respect to standardization and clearing.
Can I make a couple of comments on that? I think, first of all, I'd agree. For repositories to work, you need 100% trade population. And if you look at electronic trade confirmation today, in the credit market, about 99% of trades are electronically confirmed. In the interest rate market, about 80% are confirmed, about 90% could be if everyone used the available platforms. So with 1% or 10%, there is definitely a gap. And it's important those transactions are collected electronically. Clearly, they can't be collected in a format that's a full legally binding ISDA-type confirmation. But there needs to be a feed for those on the same basis. I think coming back to this question of what the repository should do with that data, I think in terms of must do, the only thing they must do is report it to regulators and the public. And the types of reporting varies whether you're talking about they exist for systemic risk perspectives, which are really about positions, or whether it's market surveillance perspectives, which means you need a full independent audit trail on every trade. And that's the sort of decision for commissioners to take. But probably what repositories should do is use that data for something else as well. I don't think it matters too much what that something else is. But it's a truism in almost any system you build within a firm or in a regulatory environment. If you fire data into a black hole with no feedback, generally the quality deteriorates. And you see that with transaction reporting in Europe, where firms for many years have had a requirement to report derivatives and cash products to regulators. They fire them every day into this black hole. They never know whether they got it right. And every few years, people get very large fines for having missed literally millions of transactions that are misreported. And I think an important thing about what Stuart does at DTC and what some other people around this table do is they collect the data for a purpose which the participants then use, whether it's settlement, whether it's reconciliation, whether it's something else. If it's wrong, it affects their own business processes and they will fix it, probably much faster than a regulator will spot a failure to report trades. So I do think it's important that SDRs fulfill their primary function of creating regulatory transparency, but if they're going to be accurate, then there needs to be something that the industry itself is using them for. And also that, I think positions them more as a benefit to the industry as opposed to a regulatory burden in terms of reporting.
Now let's move on. We'd like to move on to the next question. We may try to come back a little bit later.
Thank you. Given the highly confidential nature of SDR information, what are some of the actions that an SDR might take or the rules an SDR might implement that will help to maintain the privacy of all swap transaction information? Particularly, what internal processes and safeguards should an SDR establish to protect the confidentiality of swap data in its possession?
Well, certainly you can start by having high levels of security protocols for encrypting the data from the outside. I think internally you can set up code bases for protecting the individual counterparties as well as their activities with whoever's on the other side of the ticket. So, I think, again, it should be fairly comprehensive to be able to implement that. I think most of us around the table already have those levels of security around their own day-to-day businesses. So I think it's just really taking that to the next level, allowing regulators to come in and also view We also would have to be able to provide access and proof that the regulators looking in are indeed authorized. So having the proper administration tools with each regulator and getting the proper approvals for access to the system would be key. I think on that note of being able to access the information, clearly given the global coordination of trying to get the reform in place, there should be a mechanism for global access easily. Clearly using the internet would be an advantage, and there are certain protocols that would allow for secure access over the internet.
I would agree with those comments of Thanasis Diplas from Deutsche Bank. Obviously, for us as participants, the protection of that information is paramount. We want to ensure that it doesn't fall in the wrong hands. We also, flipping kind of the privacy question that you just mentioned, we also believe that the parties that need to know have to have access to that, and that means the various regulators. And we've been working on this topic, obviously, actually for the last couple of years. One of the issues that we have is basically kind of different laws across the globe that sometimes inhibit that access of the various regulators. I think the regulatory community has been doing a lot of work to try to actually create a framework that actually enables the parties that need to know to have access to that information legally. But right now, a lot of us as participants are hamstrung by different laws in various jurisdictions that doesn't allow us to fully reveal the counterparty names, etc. So I think we need the help with the regulators to actually overcome some of these issues.
Along those lines, how do you think U.S. registered SDRs should meet the indemnification requirements of Section 21D2?
Well, that would entail every provider of data to the SDR indemnifying each SDR. So there would have to be a legal contract negotiated with each data providers, and presumably they would have permission to present that data to the SDR.
I think this is an important issue, and obviously the indemnification standard hasn't been determined, but clearly there's global interest in data in repositories, and they're not restricted by national borders in terms of these markets, right? They are global markets. So security underlyings, US issued securities may be referenced in credit derivative transactions. They may be between two European participants. The SEC would have an interest in that data set, but that data set is really a European one by domicile of those participants. Reciprocally, there's European situations where US firms will be trading on European underlyings, and Europeans will want that data. So this indemnification issue is important. At DTCC, currently we're pre-legislation. This regulation in this regard. We are actively sharing data throughout the globe. We have a set of working standards that we've agreed with the OTC Derivatives Regulators Forum for that sharing, and it determines different types of regulators and potentially different interests. So certain information that is systemic risk data that is shared in aggregates within certain jurisdictions, their interest in some of the more significant financial institutions in those jurisdictions, but also people who are writing contracts related to those financial institutions. We share in aggregate. To prudential supervisors throughout the world, we will share data from their regulatees, and to markets regulators, we will share data relating to the domicile of the underlying. And the parties, where both parties or one party is within the market domicile for that markets regulator. Now, like what we've done at DTCC, in part to manage a number of issues. So there's issues. Clearly there's a sense that from other countries that data needs to be resident on shore. there's some of the privacy issues that Thanasis referred to, and there's this indemnification issue. So, as a repository, where we are today is that, we have a European entity as well as a US entity, and we intend that the European entity will share data, locally to those regulators, and will use, the US vehicles in the US. So, there are some things that can be done by the repositories to manage some of those issues in terms of their corporate structure, but I think some of the real test is as to the indemnification standards that's set.
This is Bruce Tupper with ICE. I think this topic would be a great one to engage the standards bodies, especially in energies, with. There's a body called the Contract Drafting Committee that resides on the EEI, and it's composed of mainly industry attorneys. I would recommend the Commission work with that group to pretty much detail what is that indemnification agreement and how to, the topics that were mentioned earlier with jurisdictions. In energies, many of the participants will create separate entities, obviously by location. So especially with large majors and financial institutions, they'll create a U.S., London, and Asian branch, and each of those will actually be legal entities that they confirm their trades under. So there are arrangements in place how they share data and how they interact, and I think formalizing that with this contract drafting committee would be a great start. The implementation of the agreement, I just speak quickly about a similar issue we had where we needed to implement kind of a multilateral agreement so customers would recognize electronic confirmations. When we began in Energies 8 years ago, there really wasn't a provision for that. So we worked closely with ISDA and industry attorneys to develop an annex type agreement that was multilateral. That works very well in energies because of the just number of participants. So then once this agreement's actually, the legalese is defined and everyone's in agreement what they want, the actual implementation of that should be done via a standards body and be multilateral in nature. I think that will lead to very quick adoption of the indemnification terms.
It's Raf from Troptima. I could just echo some Thanasis and Stuart's points. Obviously, the financial data, it's very sensitive, and especially when a large amount of it is aggregated into one place. And as a commercial provider of a central service to the OTC swap market, we've, over the years, had to balance the needs for our customers' sensitivity and privacy of their data with the value of the service that we're providing. And we've managed to solve that to the point where we've got 6 million live contracts under reconciliation. And I think that shows, to Stuart's point, that technologically and the security can be solved. It's really the legal question of how the regulators and the entities that want to see this data appropriately can agree with each other how to achieve that as a regulatory legal structure.
Any other comments on that? And we'll move on.
Let me move to the area of sort of the commercial aspect of the SDR running its business, and in particular, what kinds of fees, if any, should SDRs be permitted to charge for various services, and any other commercial aspects that you might like to comment on?
So DDCC's model is relatively simple. We're an at-cost utility model, and our fee structure is based on the real costs of providing the service.
Yeah, we would echo that. I think the fee is really for the service of complying with the regulatory requirements in the case of a swap data repository. And really, as a service provider, our goal would be to fulfill the requirements from the industry and the regulators on the swap data repository on a cost-based fee charge. And I think the balance that we've found is that some sort of relation to the amount of live contracts that a party has for the basis of the fee strikes a reasonable balance.
I think there may be some delicate kind of issues in this context, particularly if there wind up being competing swap data repositories. It does seem to me, excuse me, fundamentally, it's going to be an awkward issue for this is an awkward issue for regulators, because I think traditionally regulators don't really want to be. I think financial regulators have traditionally not wanted to be in the price setting, in the price setting or price fixing business. And on the one hand, I see real advantages to there being, at least in specific spaces, single data repositories for particular asset classes. And there was earlier discussion about this, but then keep it, and I think that probably is a desirable model. But then there are pricing issues that the financial regulators are going to need to confront, as with other utility and monopoly kind of models. And I think this is an important issue to highlight, because over time, the business of exchanges, for example, in other spaces, has become very different. It's not become kind of a business about collecting specialists kind of making money by doing trading themselves. These businesses have kind of transformed themselves into data businesses and into businesses with different kind of products and specialized kind of products. So I think there are other kind of issues that one will need to think about with respect to what are the ways in which the swap data, what can the swap data repositories do with the data beyond the functions that you specifically will mandate them to do, and that you obviously want them to do per the statute. Can they, for example, provide forms of their data as value-added products to selective buyers? I think these are real issues with a lot of economics, and while they're not sort of directly on the radar screen today, I think as the staff sort of introspect about the history of platforms like the New York Stock Exchange, for example, where these issues became, and in the equity spaces where these issues became more and more important over time, I think the analogies to this context are potentially important ones.
If I could, Mark Dixon, Evolution Markets, just to build on that point, it raises the real question, which is who owns the data, and therefore what you can do with it. Or is it the market participant licensing the repository for its purposes? And so I think it gets very complex. And I wanted to build on one other point from an earlier question, which is as we get into cross-border discussions around security and access control, the data that is going from one host station to another shouldn't go to a lesser standard or lesser quality. And I think that's something that we need to ensure remains at the highest level possible.
Mark,
I think I could follow back to what Chester, Chester mentioned. We had thought long and hard in terms of the actual model for the SDRs. The market, even before the legislation came into existence, had made certain selections for asset classes such as credit rates, etc. We had gone down the utility route because we wanted to ensure that because it is a fundamental function that we thought we should not be necessarily subject to competition, and it was done as a request for proposal. But there are other elements of the framework that we thought are actually important to be open to competition. For example, execution is in that realm, clearing is in that realm, etc. But the repository function is one that we thought should be centralized, it should be done effectively at cost for market participants. Now I think even more with the legislation being enacted and having the requirement to have it there, it makes it even more important that basically market participants will be subject to monopoly type kind of conducive environment, and I think the utility model works very well in that respect.
Yeah, I don't think, I think a lot of the comments are very valid, right? We don't, as DDCC, see that we're in the business of trying to commercialize the data we have. We think, the utility model is a good model. We talked about fragmentation earlier. So this idea of at cost seems to come with the recognition that this service shouldn't be overly fragmented. And some of the decisions we made in our corporate history have involved us preserving some of the services alongside the repository that we think are a horizontal offering and not really benefit from a level of scale and fit very directly with the repository offering. And some other services, if people may know this, but the original service started as a confirm service that also had this associated centralized database. And we've separated that confirmation service, and that now operates in a more competitive landscape, separately from the repository, and the repository can sit there more as a utility offering.
Mark, you mentioned the question of who owns the data, and Stuart, you talked about commercializing the data. Any of you that are likely to be repositories, do you foresee any use that you think you would make of the data, or would legitimately make of the data, without the permission of the data owner? Even if it's sort of aggregated and so forth, where you're not revealing parties, but any use at all?
Well, I think to address your point and previous points, one, I think to induce market competition by allowing any party to register, whether they get approved or not is up to the Commission. But I think allowing for competition would help level the playing field in terms of pricing. In terms of the actual data itself, I think one of the goals of the reform is to allow more transparency and efficiency in the marketplace. And probably some of the criticisms of the over-the-counter derivative markets in the past have been sort of behind the black curtain. So I would have thought that having some way to publicize the data, whether it's a ticker type approach as to what were recent trades or high last trade volumes, that sort of data that you currently can get from the exchanges, would be of the benefit to the public and to the marketplace.
In regards to data, what we do basically is, I think with energies is there's not a lot of commercial value to the data. Okay, so we confirm about 25,000 transactions a week. Really, the only commercial value I really say is because when you're dealing with this number of participants and the diversity of technical expertise, you're really getting down to the point is how quickly can these participants submit the information to you. Data, the value really is you're looking at real-time data, end-of-day reports. If that data is not received, or it typically is not quick enough into the system to then be processed, it's really not a system issue from the central provider, but really receiving and translating everything. So really the only values we're really seeing with the data is, for energies, really is the bid week data and natural gas. They do an assessment for all those who aren't familiar, the last 3 trading days, and then the following month you're able to add to any type of indices for first of the month natural gas indexes. Really short of that, I don't really believe there's going to be a lot of commercial value with an SDR for energies. We haven't seen that at all. I think as far as, just to take a step back, I know we did talk a lot about security and how that's done. I know there's a lot of standard processes in the industry. I think really just formalizing those and making them very transparent and public is probably the best way to go. We follow a very rigid security process, as pretty much everybody at the table here does. We make available our audits to our customers. I know that gives them a lot of comfort, so they actually can see what we're doing, what we commit to, and then the results of those audits. I'd recommend that as well.
Stuart, you mentioned that DTCC has sort of formed a separate legal entity for some of the services you provide. Is that a model that others agree is the correct model?
And just I guess the one thing I will say about it again, we've positioned the warehouse to be this open access vehicle. So we want wherever kind of execution happens or the legal wrappers are put around trades, that's how we'd like to source trades to the extent we can. Comments about the so-called copper records, the ones that can't be fully described electronically, but again, we'd like to see those pre-matched up front in some electronic form very early in the life cycle. So this is a little bit throws back to the confirmation point. But the other thing we're doing, the other part of our model is we allow our users to permission the data we have for use. So there are for example, we have a feed of data to Troptima, right, which assists in their portfolio rec service. So so that's the other thing. So if our users want us to provide the data to another service, we will do that. So we are trying to position ourselves in this open utility position, for this set of services. Now, a little bit, you started with my name, but the question was to everybody else.
Yeah, the question might actually be sort of to others. Is that the model that should be followed, or are other models equally acceptable?
This is Mark Dixon with Evolution. I would say with absolute certainty there's a potential for commercialization of the data set. I would also say that you can have cooperatives, such as Stuart's suggesting, wherein this can be done at we'll call it at cost, wherein the participants who are providing the data and license that data for its own purposes or for other purposes to meet regulatory obligations can be done in such a way that you don't have this runaway model that somehow stifles market activity. But I would say that something's going to have to be looked at very carefully. So I think the market participants are going to take the view that it's their data. The repository will probably take the view that it's data. And so, therein comes the rub.
Yeah, I'd agree with those points. I think Stuart mentions the interoperation point, and I think that's a worthwhile example to mention, that with the correct legal framework, then data can be exchanged between venues for the benefit of the mutual subscribers. And there are some strong examples of that. We exchange a large amount of data with DTCC, and that enriches the exposure management and valuation that we're doing. In terms of separate legal entities, we'd be receptive to guidance as to if that is the best way to proceed. I think as a commercial service that has built an exposure management service, really for us it's about balancing delivering value to the subscribers to the service, alongside with respecting that it's their data that we're working with. But it's really the value that we deliver justifies them submitting it to us and having it aggregated and getting the value back on it. And so it's really delivering that value that has enabled us to assemble that data and see the 6 million live contracts.
So I think another related facet that strikes me as really crucial with respect to data is who's going to be the recipient of the data. And we're kind of circling around this issue a little bit. We kind of have in mind, I think, kind of a couple of alternatives. The legislation clearly is most directly focused upon the CFTC, the SEC, and the Federal Reserve, et cetera, the government financial regulators, as being the downstream recipient of all the data, at least in key forms, that come from the swap data repositories, with the exception perhaps of some simple aggregates being made publicly available. And clearly, with respect to what's publicly available, obviously there's issues about confidentiality and the like. But it also seems that there are potentially categories in between what we as in some of the discussion about the value of the data and the possibility of value added services. It sort of points out that there might be categories of data that might be in between, that that interested parties, maybe asset managers or certainly the financial intermediaries might be very interested in. I think also the ability to provide the data there's a kind of a whole other dimension as well, which is the ability to provide the data to the public. Potentially that increases with longer lags, or you can potentially provide more this type of data might be more and more relevant to provide to the public with longer lags. I think sometimes the vision of collecting the data is that the data is then only going to be provided to the government officials, and in some ways that might not be the only way to try to manage systemic risk. One of the real problems that we had in 2007 and 2008 was arguably some of the officials charged with the responsibilities had difficulty separating what was systemic risk from what wasn't systemic risk, and there was sort of almost no information that was sort of out there about underlying mortgage exposures to the investing public. And I think one of the ways in which the government officials can be helped is by providing more information to the public to the extent that it can be. This was one of the severe problems in 2007 and 2008. There was a period of about a year where it was completely unclear who was holding these underlying mortgage exposures. People knew in the aggregate there were exposures, but how they were distributed and what the systemic risk implications of this was completely murky. So I think there's a number of aspects about data. I think it's not simply about what in the most aggregated way might be public versus then what, and obviously in all the detail would be made available to the regulators. But also then how over time, especially with some reasonable lags, what could be provided.
Okay, is there one more, anything more on this? Make it quick because we'd like to move on to the next.
Sure. I kind of feel like everyone's avoided answering the question that Sebastian originally set. So I think just to make clear, in my view, is the data is owned by the participants, and therefore an SDR or Confirm Service or anybody else should only be disclosing information for one of two reasons. The regulations required it, or the participant gave the permission for it to be disclosed. I don't think there's any sense which ownership should move in this sense. And I agree with Chester. Some of the information has value. I think the post-trade stuff probably doesn't have a great value in the sense you could charge a big fat fee for sending it out to people, but it has value to the public. If you look at what Stuart does weekly in the CDS data, I think that's very healthy for the public, very healthy for the health of the markets, even though, frankly, probably no one would pay a lot of money to receive that feed if it wasn't publicly available.
Yeah, very quickly, as a user, I would agree with those comments. We believe the data is ours. We pay for the storage in that environment, and we need to work, obviously, with the regulators in terms of what is the appropriate set of data to be disseminated to the public for those systemic risk reasons that Chester mentioned.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, but not before thanking Jeff for the answer. Thank you. So we're going to switch gears, but this will dovetail with something that Chester was mentioning. The Commission's use of the data, and one of the statutory requirements is that the SDRs provide, quote, direct electronic access to the data. I'd just like to hear some thoughts on, especially again from the potential SDR's perspective. How do you envision direct electronic access at a mechanical level? What does that mean? Is that reports from you whenever we want it? Does it mean that we have a direct pipe into your systems with our own interface? Does it mean we have access to the very tools that your own staff might be using? How do you see that working?
Well, currently we provide a similar sort of access to auditors of our clients, the Big Four audit firms, and we get permission from our clients and we get requests from our clients to allow them access. So the way that mechanism currently works could be passed on post-reform. So basically, you could get read-only access, thin client internet access, so easily to access from here in DC or by the EC in Europe. Our vision would be to provide specific reporting that would be tailored to what the regulators would want to view in terms of large positions, potential risk, et cetera, but then allow flexible reporting to slice and dice all of this data, this comprehensive data, the way the regulators want to look at it. So I think there needs to be that combination of templated reporting that all regulators are looking at, as well as the ability to real-time, or at least on-demand, flexibly analyze this data.
You may have said this, but just to be clear, for your auditors, the access you provide are they creating the interface that they see your data through, or are they using your own interface?
Well, we provide a interface so they can log in through Internet Explorer and quickly access trade detail to comprehensive reports to stress testing, those types of analytics. So it really is more of a solution, not just a data warehouse.
Yeah, I think the answer is all of the forms are admissible ways of getting data, and you will need flexibility in accessing data. We've currently got as far as permissioning regulators through a web interface into some scheduled reports. That's as far as we've got. But we certainly envisage it going further, and we envisage giving you define query access. One of the problems, with just roaming around our database a little bit is you have to understand the data. So, like it needs to be formatted and brought back to you in a meaningful way. A lot of the records, again, right, we're trying to receive the whole audit trail associated with a trade, its whole life cycle. Not every version of every message we've got is valid at any point in time. So sifting through some of those issues to do with the audit trail we have in our system, you probably need some support, from us and our side of the raw data. But I think we still imagine that you will be to receive that data electronically and manipulate it, yourself and potentially directly query. But there will still be something our side just to make sure the data, comes to you in a clean and sensible manner.
Yes, from TriOptima's perspective, we'd agree with those comments. I think we built our interest rate repository service out of our exposure management service to the requirements that were given to us by the industry and the regulators in conjunction. So requirements would be really valuable to start off with. But I think, fundamentally, the model that we based it on, assuming that the regulators have access to the raw data, the line item by line item data, that's one level, but also I think the systemic risk monitoring point, some front page where you can actually see the highest level aggregation is going to be really valuable. And then in between those two, the opportunity to filter and sort and drill into the data. And those are all services that we currently provide on our exposure management platform quite successfully. And as I say, with some guidance about the requirements, I think we could be producing some quite interesting opportunities to get into the data in more detailed level.
This is Bruce from ICE. I think as a follow-up to access, based on meetings we've had with the DMO of the CFTC, we heard a lot of feedback in regards to aggregation of data. So, I believe creating reports on the front end and giving the commission access and how they'd like to see it, that's a pretty simple task I think can be accomplished by there's a competency at this table to do that. I think the big question is aggregating the data amongst energy clearinghouses and also the OTC data. Is that a responsibility that the commission wants to have, or is that something of the repository? Because in order to get that holistic view, there's a lot of cleared transactions that have been developed out of the OTC market over the past 6 years. So, just take natural gas, for example, there's a number of basis contracts that, were never cleared. They had high liquidity, and then obviously the clearinghouses created their list of liquidity instead of developing those. The way you're going to want to view that, it'd be easy enough to create you a report that would just show you what is the open interest of the basis contracts at a particular point, but now you have to deal with, you also have open interest in two different clearinghouses. So that effective netting of the three, how you want to accomplish that, something I heard that regularly when I had meetings with the DMO, and I want to achieve that. It's a question of whether the systems are here to do it, or that's a duty of the repository. For us, it would be pretty straightforward thing to take in and aggregate, because that's what we do today. That's not difficult. So I think that's a big consideration. I think whatever ends up coming out of it, I just would say working with the staff who's going to be using these reports and helping them develop screens and interfaces that really help them achieve their job is probably would solve that.
I think one thing just to keep in mind with this is there's a big difference between information and data, and we need to work out what's the information that's actually useful to the commissions to do their job. I'm going to give you sort of an order of scale. At the moment we do about 20 million transactions a year through our systems, which presumably most of which would be of interest to people around this table. The audit trail for the interest rate market alone is 80 million records, which is what we hold. We don't have quite everything, so there's a few bits to add to that. That's an enormous amount of information. And when you look into that, an awful lot of the activity in the market is not, for example, price-forming events. It's movements to clearinghouses of trades that were done OTC, subsequently cleared, trades that were compressed with, through TriOptima or others. There's a variety of things that happens to trades through the life cycle, which is important to understand. And I think we need to do a much better job is saying, okay, what type of information used for what purpose, and find a way of extracting that. It's all technically doable. I think people around this table can do it, but it's not just a question. I think some people seem to think it's a question of having 6 million current positions or 20 million transactions or whatever, whichever number everyone's holding, and handing them over. It's a little bit more complex than that. It's solvable, but there's real work to do.
I think Bruce highlighted kind of the issue of what happens in a fragmented infrastructure between OTC, different clearinghouses, etc., and that's the need for, I think, aggregation at an asset class level. I think that is fundamental. And the problem that Jeff highlighted, of course, is true. You're going to have an issue with too much information, not too little information, and actually trying to use that in a way that you can get something out of it is fundamental. Obviously, and also your own needs as regulators are not unique. I mean, systemic risk issues are different. They rely much more on intelligent aggregation, but market surveillance is completely much more granular task. And the repository has to be able to provide both, basically. But I want to highlight a lot on the systemic risk issue. The intelligent aggregation is the most fundamental point.
I'd just like to pick up on what Jeff and Thanasis said. Jeff made an excellent point. There is also, as well as getting the live contracts that you're seeing, there's the time dimension, there's the history of all the previous submissions that you've had, and providing a reporting access to that. In our experience, providing the exposure management service, that's been one of the most valuable features that the subscribers have benefited from, is the ability to see the state of the transactions on previous dates and graph that and watch that over history. And so that's another extremely important dimension to the requirements, because once you start accumulating this data on a regular basis, you just develop more and more needs for reporting, and that's one of the values, but it's also one of the challenges is to satisfy those requirements.
I would echo that on the data retention. That's going to grow as a challenge over time. I would also suggest that once the commissions decide on what they need, then it becomes a little more straightforward for people to provide complete, accurate, timely, and more importantly, actionable information. Otherwise, you're just caught up in a mire of data that isn't actionable. And you can also start to raise questions around the integrity of that data, and that becomes a distraction from the main effort, I think.
Any other?
Thank you.
I'd like to move on to one of the core principles identified in Dodd-Frank, in particular governance. I'd be interested in your views as to governance structures that might be appropriate with a view to giving full access to market participants.
So DDCC's model is a user governance. We certainly think that makes sense in the environment that we're in and for the services we're providing. Now, some of that needs some kind of diversity as well in terms of the wider public interest, and they also should be represented. And the main board at DDCC has some independent board members. It has buy and sell side members, and that's the structure that we would advocate.
Well, at Reval, we've actually currently put in place a chief compliance officer with pretty extensive experience in both the derivative market making experience and on the buy side. His current path would be to report into independent board members of Reval. Actually, I should also add that in addition to additional governance, there are certifications like a SAS 70 Type 2, where an external audit firm can come in and audit your controls and processes around how the SDR is, functioning. That can cover, a wide range of processes from data verification to valuation. So I think that's another aspect that could be considered.
Can I maybe just amplify the question a little bit, because we had another roundtable on conflicts and governance with respect to CEFs and clearing agencies, and spent a lot of time talking about the nature of the conflicts that could arise that might inform our policy choices about what types of governance structures to promote. So my question, I think, in picking up on Joanne's question, is what are the policy issues here around governance that we should be taking into account? Are there the same types of concerns that there are with the CEFs and the clearing agencies, at least as drivers of the requirement that we study that issue under the statute, or is a data repository a different animal?
I would think it is a different animal. I mean, we haven't seen this type of conflicts. I mean, I know there's a lot of conflicts that have been mentioned with respect to CEFs or CCPs, but on the repositories, especially being run as utilities, we have not had any issues of conflicts. And I think the model has worked well with the users kind of participating in that respect. But it is open. It's mandated by law for everybody to actually put the trades in there, and they don't even have the right to, I think, to turn anybody away. So we have not experienced this type of conflicts before, and I don't expect to experience them the same way. For once, it might be an easier situation.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I believe it is a different animal when you look at the nature of a clearinghouse versus that of a swap data repository, processing post-trade events. You know, the conflicts of interest that you would have in an SDR really are much different than that of a clearinghouse. I believe the earlier panel members pretty much said, usually you'll create a governance board of your participants, some type of procedures guide around that with restrictions around how that could be changed, and then obviously assess 70 Type 2 audit afterwards. That process has worked well for us for 8 years, and if a customer does want to make a change, obviously it requires a majority of users to agree to that process, and then a change in the audit, and then everybody kind of sees it. So I think this self-governing kind of governance structure for SDRs has worked well in energies. We could formalize it with the commission, but there haven't been any issues today with it.
There was the main comment is that the rules are relatively prescriptive in terms of data sharing. So yeah, I think that is valid. But there was earlier a conversation about commercializing data, and although it's a lesser dynamic, if that were a dynamic, that does have some degree of relevance.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd agree with that too. I think my inclination is the same as many of the panelists, that it's not obvious that there are going to be severe governance problems here. But, at the same time, I think one also wants to be sensitive to the possibility that governance problems might arise. I'm not suggesting being overly prescriptive with respect to how this issue is approached. But I do think that the analogy to a clearing organization is not completely inappropriate. One of the issues here that we discussed earlier was the importance of the swap data repository dealing with non-electronic data that comes in the context of customized contracts. Now, one could imagine issues about the pricing for dealing with those versus dealing with the cleaner, smoother electronic data, where, for example, just like in the context of clearing, there would be kind of competitive issues vis-a-vis the dealers who would be competing on the customized margin. Exactly the same economics seems to me to be at least potentially at play, and I think that at least in principle could be a context in which there's a first-order conflict. Now, I don't want to overemphasize that, but I think at least it is possible, certainly, that there could be some governance conflicts.
I think a lot depends on what the other rules say about SDRs. And I think everyone's sort of more or less concluded that SDRs as currently envisaged don't present major conflict of interest issues. But that's largely because we're talking about a utility not-for-profit model. We're talking about an open access model. We're talking about something that's unbundled from other services. We're talking about a data set that's made available because the users say it can be, or because the regulations require it. If those things are all there, then I think the SDRs are probably relatively safe in terms of conflicts. If you imagine a very different world with for-profit SDRs bundling services with other commercial offerings, saying they own the data, then maybe you would have issues. And I think, it's probably best not to over-engineer and have both fixes. But if we go down, the things we've been talking about earlier on, I think that probably gives you quite a lot of guarantees.
Oh, I can say from TriOptima's perspective, our experience as a commercial provider of our exposure management system, we've obviously been totally reliant on satisfying the needs of our subscribers, and so they've had a strong voice in the way the service evolves. But since we've operated the interest rate trade repository, we've organized that with a governance committee from the industry alongside the regulators. And as we're regulated in Europe, we have a compliance function there too. And I think we would see this, first of all, to implement the regulations and the rules that are written here, and then to take that forward. Just to Chester's point, though, in our exposure management service, we are already reconciling between the parties to the trades a large amount of those exotic and non-electronically confirmed trades on a regular basis. So we have a successful experience of that also.
Can I just follow up on Jeff's point quickly, because I think this is an interesting question, and how the fees relate to it, and our model of what do we have in mind? What are our assumptions about the activities of a data repository? And in some ways, I think you were setting up a choice that you could worry a lot about governance, or you could restrict the activities of a repository to unbundled services, or of a utility model and the like. And I want to make sure I understood you correctly, because I think
that was the point, but I'm not saying one company can't do both. I mean, Raf's given an example where he runs both models side by side with some separation of governance and structure. So I think he doesn't say that one company can't do more than one thing, but I think if you're going to say SDRs are a sort of mandatory thing in terms of regulation, then you have to put certain protections around them in terms of making sure that they don't abuse that position. I think you either go down the governance route, but governance is kind of a blunt instrument to fix some of these problems. I think putting them in a place where there inherently aren't conflicts in terms of the role is probably a safer route to go down.
All right.
I'd like to go back for a minute to Jiro's comment and to the last question. Reval has a chief compliance officer, presumably with enumerated duties. SDRs will be required under the statute to designate CCO, and I'm wondering if the other panelists can discuss any specific regulatory functions that you all believe a CCO might perform or oversee. Or not.
I mean, that role, we have a person who does that. It's a kind of executive role where they overview our processes. That role typically, I would say, it's a person who manages the SAS 70 Type 2 audit that was mentioned earlier. So you're going to work with the commission and the participants to draft the procedures that are acceptable to run an SDR, and then managing that audit process thereafter, and working with the auditors to make all the statements and then follow-up validation that you're doing what you said you would do in your audit. I think that person also could liaise with the commission on it as a follow-up of any needs or requirements that they would want in that audit, and just give assurances. I think anyone who's operating this type of service, I can speak for Intercontinental Exchange. We offer a lot of exchange services. We operate the e-confirm service in a very independent manner, separate staff. The SDR hardware is its own. Nothing else runs on it. The developers or the people with the access to the data only work for this SDR. There's this. I don't want to get too granular, but there are certain procedures I think that are practice that you would want in that audit. Things that may come out of the rulemaking process would have to also be added as well.
Good. So we are a regulated entity. So what we find our compliance officer, KYC, AML work. We have a customer base. We do that with. They're very interested in the governance model, the duties of the various structures within our organisation. So the board responsibilities, the executive management responsibilities, some of the connectivity between them, and they focus on risk issues. So how we've documented and managed our processes, and clearly they are actively engaged, talking to our regulator.
I think I'd just like to add some of the other reasons why we think some of the other roles that the chief CCO can have would be to help evaluate all of the trades that don't make it into the swap data repository and sit on the commission's desk to figure out, is there a process, what is the process to get those trades into a swap data repository? So it's going to be obviously all of the uncleared trades and customized trades that could grow over time. There's another section in the Frank-Dodd bill that the Dodd-Frank bill that has the SDR's responsibility to check on the end user clearing exemption. So I think that again is another detailed process that the Chief Compliance Officer will have to work with the Commission to help understand how to vet that process.
Let me follow up on that and borrow a little bit from our sort of models that exist in the futures exchange world. We sort of have these separate compliance departments. There's usually an executive in charge of that, and they're not a silo, but they're their own organizational group within the exchange. Do you envision that a CCO or an SDR would be something similar, that they have a sort of a staff and that they are their own sort of center within the SDR? Or are they more one or two people who are sort of managing conversations and relationships with outside groups?
Well, I think it'd be very difficult if you're going to be chief, it implies you have somebody to be chief of.
Right.
So yeah, I think there'd be a staff that would help, with the day-to-day. I mean, it's going to be a very important and big task to, help govern all of these trades, whether it's, one SDR per asset class or multiple. I think it's going to be pretty challenging.
Right, but it wouldn't be just sort of outside, for example, your auditors that you are working with. You would envision that there is a lot happening in-house in terms of monitoring or verifying compliance by the SDR with whatever obligations end up being imposed.
I don't think there's as much importance to create that Chinese wall and separate the duties so much, since it is post-trade, as other panels have mentioned. But again, I think there should be some pretty strict and clear guidelines as to what the compliance team can do with the data, access to that data. So certainly some separation on that front.
I think there's two different sorts of compliance here that we need to think about. One is SDR as a regulated entity will need to have a compliance function which should be independent, all the things that any financial institution or serious market infrastructure has today. Certainly, market servers, we're regulated in the UK, for example, so I have a compliance officer and a weekly compliance meeting, and we have endless policies and rules and regulations about things and all that kind of stuff, which I think is important. I think one interesting question you get into is, if the new regime is going to work effectively, who's ensuring the industry itself is compliant, in the sense of, if someone doesn't report a set of trades to the SDR or misreports them, what happens with that in terms of follow-up? Ultimately, who levies fines on the individual participant? Does that go back to the commissions? In other markets, it often goes back to an SRO. I think some very serious questions there around not only just how the SDR manage itself, but then how does the whole framework manage itself, and who's having those functions. I'm not entirely sure the SDR should be the SRO, but we can think about how that interaction would work, and that's probably something more complex to set up.
And I think, to follow up on Jeff's observations, I think the issue of the scale of this function it depends obviously intimately on the responsibility. If it's simply the compliance of the swap data repository with respect to its own rules, kind of at a relatively mechanical level, and interfacing with the regulator, that might suggest the need for a relatively modest staff. If, on the other hand, there's a more activist role with respect to either upstream kinds of issues, as in the SRO in one extreme, or even to deal with the non-electronic orders and making sure that these are being handled in an appropriate way, that could suggest, again, significantly more staffing kind of needs. So I think the scale of the staff of the Chief Compliance Officer depends very much upon the model of what is the role with respect to those kind of issues.
Okay, well, let's move on.
I'd like to go back to the issue of other duties or responsibilities that an SDR might have, that might need to have, that aren't necessarily set forth in Dodd-Frank, and in particular, your views as to whether SDR should have a market surveillance function.
I think a little bit there depends on how you're going to define market surveillance. I'm not trying to avoid answering the question. I think in terms of generating reporting to monitor the market, I think given the earlier comments we had about the amount of data out there and the complexity, I think it will fall on the SDR to create the right reports to spot things. Market surveillance is about more than reading reports. So I think a good market surveillance department is investigating issues, looking at market rumours, everything else. And that's where I think this question about, does the SDR do that? Does the CFTC and SEC do it? Is there some SRO that does it? That's something I think needs to get decided about how that follow-up works. I think if you read the Act, it would sort of imply the commissions are doing that themselves, in which case the SDR is very much providing information to support that function rather than launching its own investigations. But I don't know what others think.
I think that when it gets to market surveillance, going back to the original point about an SDR having a comprehensive view of all the trades in the OTC swap market, that's one sort of approach from the point of view of developing a software service to cover that. Market surveillance, on the other hand, tends to be asset class specific. You're going to end up looking for specific things in specific asset classes. And so it's somewhat important to be clear, to give an SDR a set of functions that are cohesive and providing comprehensive reporting across the whole of the OTC swap market, all asset classes and all instrument types is one value, and then providing market surveillance, which could get into different things, meaning different things for different asset classes, because there are some pretty diverse asset classes within the OTC swap landscape. It could end up a rather broad mandate for a repository.
I think at ICE we really didn't view the SDR as being a policing function for the industry. I think we when reading Dodd-Frank, you look at the duties, and it seems like it more or less provides the facility for obviously the commission to do that. I can say to date in energies, I don't believe there's any expectation that the procedures and rules of the SDR would have a market surveillance aspect to them. I think though that the energy participants do expect that the SDR would provide the commission with that ability to view that data and make their decisions on what's happening in the OTC market. So obviously having a robust regulatory functionality within the system would allow the commission to do that. But I can speak, there really aren't any rules or procedures in place today that I know for at least energy's market that you could build on. So it really isn't there.
Yeah, let me just qualify, because perhaps my use of the phrase market surveillance took us in a different direction than I really intended, because Dodd-Frank refers to monitoring, screening, and analyzing data. And that's really what I was trying to get at. So if you could speak to whether you think that's an area that SDRs should undertake some obligations, and if so, what is your view as to what that means?
Yeah, the summer.
Joanne, if I could just add, because that same provision speaks to end user exemption claims. So as part of your answers, if you could just also give your opinion as to specifically that function, what you see as the SDR's role there in terms of monitoring those claims.
Okay, so the first part, I believe I kind of summarized that, would be pretty much providing this regulatory functionality or user login that would have all these reports and provide the commission with that ability. The end user, that's an interesting one, especially in energy and commodities, because there would be effectively, I believe, a lot of participants seeking that category. Today, a number of our customers are what I would classify as end users, or they make up a high percentage. Many of them do use the service, or what they seek a lot of benefit with electronic confirmations in general. So if you start off and say, why would an end user use a confirmation service? To them, it's it's a reduction in back office costs. They can leverage a lot of the technology that the large dealers use already, and they can receive their confirmations electronic, so it's quicker. And there's just a general efficiency garnered from electronic confirmations. How that's going to work with the commission as far as these requirements to continue to use the system, I think would need to be, evaluated. There is a significant number of there's a decent amount of price discovery, especially in certain points where there are a high percentage of end users, which if that were taken out of the equation, may make it a little more difficult to realize what's going to happen in that particular delivery location or that market. So I think it is going to be a balance as far as the requirements for all end users to, report. I think there's a lot of ways that the industry could leverage technology to help them report. I think a lot of them don't have the sophistication of many of the other asset classes. So it's going to be a balance, I guess.
Well, I think the question really is it up to the swap dealer or major swap participant providing the data to also provide data that verifies that the other side of the trade qualified for the end user exemption, is not a financial entity, hedging commercial risk, or is it up to the SDR to go out and get that information? The way the bill is currently written, only one side produces the trade, so if the SDR is tasked with matching, confirming the trade to the details of what was done on the other side of the trade, as well as the end user exemption, then it would go beyond just collecting the data. We would have to have access to the counterparty information, speak to the counterparty, and confirm that they indeed qualified. So, it would be quite a big additional task if that was the intent.
Yeah, I think getting back to the fundamentals of it, following the rulemaking, the SDR, from a technology perspective, really is receiving all those line items of data and providing reports back to the regulators on it. And to the extent that from that data that's collected every time and the history of that data, valuable reports can be produced to flag up potential non-compliances or whatever, then that could be a function of the SDR. But that's really the extent of it from our perspective.
I'm not sure, though, how the SDR would be expected to perform some of this stuff. Some of that information you mentioned about the end users, the SDR doesn't really have. Frankly, neither does the dealer. You can never know whether that end user really is doing this for the reason they said they did. I mean, at some point, I think it comes down to the regulator and that end user. I think it's going to be an impossible task to expect either the SDR or the dealer to perform.
I think one other practical thing is it's not true today that all the repositories even know who the counterparties are to all of the trades. So I think one very basic thing we need to take care of is making sure that people can put that information into the repositories before we even worry about what you might do with that information later on, because that's not straightforward to do in many jurisdictions.
Yeah, that goes back to the issue, the privacy law issues that we were talking about. So you need to solve that end of the puzzle as well, basically, before you can proceed to the next one. Because what Jeff mentioned, in some jurisdictions, we cannot reveal the name of the counterparty without committing a felony, basically.
Just to summarize, what we see is about around 25% of the trades we process have a dealer associated with it. So that's at least 75% of the deals that really are not, someone who's mandated reports. So it's really, I think, going to be up to the commission to kind of provide guidance around what are going to be the requirements of end users or non-dealers to report in order to get you the data, to provide the data set you'd be looking for.
Anything more on that? Okay, thanks.
This next question is, I think I'll call it a half-formed question, but as we read the statute, we see that there might be a need for SDRs to establish emergency procedures, emergency rules, not only in the event of sort of outside natural disaster or other types of man-made events, but really market events. And we have rules certainly in the clearing and in the market and the exchange space about market events that might require the exchange to use special authority that it wouldn't otherwise be able to use. In the SDR context, do you see a similar need? Are there market events that might require the SDR to act? What might those events be, and what sort of authorities should the SDR have in that context? And if the answer is there's nothing, that's fine too.
Well, certainly if there's another potential credit event, so a significant downgrade of a swap dealer on a real-time basis, the commission may need to come in and view the data. So I think on a later panel you're going to discuss real-time. But if, I think it's certainly a better step now than it was in, say, 2 years ago, where it was hard even to understand who had the risk. So clearly a credit event could be one aspect. I think the other, what is systemic risk? There's the too big to fail type systemic risk, but I think also there's, regional systemic risk, product-related systemic risk. So if everyone is doing a certain direction in a trade and the euro dollar goes to 90 cents or something, again, could be a market-driven event. So interest rate, foreign exchange, commodity, credit, equity events could drive the commission to come in.
What would be the SDR's unique role, though? What would they have to step in to do if one of these events occurs, if anything?
So I think, how stale is the data that has come into the SDR? So if the requirements for the data providers would be, every 5 minutes or at the end of each day, I think that's one of the requirements that you would have to consider. How frequent do you need it? And then in the event that you need it in between, the time that someone's submitted the data, then, what rights do you have to all of a sudden call upon all the dealers to refresh their data, midday or middle of the night?
So I think this raises an interesting point. I've been struck in recent years by the extent to which, in other contexts, interim final rules are used when a regulator is kind of pulling out of the gate on an issue, and basically, to some degree, perhaps even arguably skirting the notice and comment process. Now, clearly, in the kind of context we're talking about, and sort of following up on the last comments, there could certainly be situations, whether it be on the one hand natural disasters, think kind of 9/11 types of things, or market kind of dislocations. And here I think not so much about May 6th, but more about what happened in 2007, 2008, where there could be some needs. But I would even here I would caution that I think to some degree better rules are rules that aren't simply sort of slapped in place over some weekend or on 6 a.m. Some morning, which is sort of what in various spaces happened in September of 2008 in a whole variety of financial regulatory spaces. We basically had short sales banned on huge numbers of financial stocks, which caused all kinds of adverse consequences, for example. It seems to me that what one would like to do is to define, to the extent one can, and one may not be always able to fully do that. I kind of appreciate that in the context of a crisis, but one should try to step back during this type of process and try to identify what would be the types of circumstances that, for example, following up on Jairo's comments, would necessitate a speed up in the provision of data. What would be those types of circumstances? And then to maybe frame some parameters as to what that speed up might be. And that's not to take away necessarily all emergency authority, kind of even incremental to that. But I think to the extent that that's kind of built into the ex ante framework, that's a much healthier system than the types of situations that we observe both at a transactional level and in a rulemaking context by the financial regulators and supervisors in 2008. So I think building it in to the fabric as best as one can is a much better way to go. And obviously, it's sort of like it's kind of like an option, or it's like a trigger, or something like that. But I think building that in so that then that has the advantage that market participants understand to some extent the rules of the game in advance. I bet in a contingent way, but understanding the rules of the game in advance, even if in a contingent way, strikes me as sort of very important, and I think likely to produce both better rules and better reactions by the market participants.
I would fully agree with that. I mean, I can't stress enough the importance of kind of legal certainty and contract certainty, especially in a stress period. I think the most problematic kind of reactions from market participants we have seen are a result of such uncertainty, especially with emergency powers. I know it was mostly an issue, like you said, Sebastian, for example, with CCPs, etc., who can actually encounter emergency type situations. but it was fundamental for us to actually deal with those kind of with a scalpel as opposed to a sledgehammer in order to actually ensure that the contract sanctity is preserved. And if there are times that emergencies need to be dealt with, but the economic characteristics of the contract need to be preserved. And if something, sometimes with respect to timing, there might be delays introduced to deal with that emergency, etc. But that should not affect the underlying contracts. I mean, if we start with that premise, I think we're okay. And we just introduce the flexibility in the system to deal with the emergencies, but we don't undermine the system.
I think the problem with emergencies is it's very hard to know what they're going to be and how to deal with them. So I think there's only two things you can probably do practically speaking. One is to have the repositories themselves as real-time and as certain information content as possible to maximize the chance that any information regulators needed to deal with the emergency was actually there at the time it happened. The other thing is about the SDR itself, in terms of BCP coverage, out-of-region support, that kind of stuff, to make sure the SDR isn't the cause of a problem or isn't actually impacted by a problem. So I think the SDR is something that's probably very dull and boring and unnecessary most days of the week. Occasionally we're going to really need it. It just needs to make sure on that day it has the information you wanted and it's actually available, whatever's happened.
Yeah, we'd totally agree with those points. I think the value of an SDR is the data that's already there when a crisis strikes. You're not about to likely change what it does in a hurry. And our exposure management service was up and running in 2008, and a lot of the firms that had already got data and history on it were able to derive significant value, and we saw a huge uptick in usage over the particular weekends of the crisis. And I think I'd agree with the point that it's the data that's already there that is going to be valuable.
I think the best thing the SDR can do in times of stress is availability. Availability is building, I'm sure everybody here, redundancy, backup facilities, DR sites into your system. To echo the point, most days of the week, and a confirmation SDR service is a pretty boring utility-like product, but all of a sudden when there is a stress event, we, like around Lehman, we received a lot of calls making sure that we were going to be up. All the trades are historically available. All that's done. I mean, that's pretty much I would say, having just technical requirements of a global scalable system would have that redundancy built into it in order to always be available in the time of stress.
Thank you.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. How do you all believe that the application and registration process for designating or registering an SDR should be structured? For example, in what technological compliance, resource, and other areas should an SDR be required to demonstrate competence and proficiency in order to be registered?
Well, I think certainly having a track record of being able to house this type of data, including the ability to understand the different trade types, book, value, process, report on these trade types is key. Track record for showing uptime, strong service level agreements, all of the security backup information that's required. I think, on the one hand, you want to encourage as many potential SDR registrants as possible, so you have some choice as you go through the actual selection process, but clearly you want to manage that a little bit and have some key requirements around the technology, ability to really deliver software, because it's not just about delivering a database, a software that can analyze the data, provide the reporting, and providing the access.
You guys are probably more expert at this than we are, but I imagine if I was sitting in your shoes, I'd worry about compliance functions, the earlier conversation, whatever the minimum requirement is, to make sure that's in place. I think BCP and security is incredibly important to make sure that whoever's filling SDR function has that. And then the final thing is, are they able and committed to providing you the data you decided you needed? So whatever that ends up being, making sure they don't have legal impediments or systemic impediments to provide that data. A lot of other things you could talk about, but if this all has to be in place by July next year, there's not going to be a lot of time. So
I would say, in addition to the system providing such a service, probably demonstrated expertise in a particular market type. the systems can function great, but obviously having a track record working with the industry to provide standardization, around changes in industry events. Energy is always an evolving market, so being able to work with industry participants to develop those standards and then list them effectively on a system. Also, I would say a proven track record of working with outside vendors, especially in energy. That's very popular. Many of the connections are provided by outside vendors. Connectivity to the market participants, demonstrate a track record of that's important, because really an SDR is only as good as its ability to aggregate and receive data. So that's another consideration in addition to all the system requirements, I think, which are pretty standardized.
What about some sort of financial resource?
Yeah, we at least for AC Confirm, that's a great question. We actually carry an operational and EOP policy. So I would think, obviously, we carry a policy of $10 million per event. So if a trade is matched in error, participants are covered. That would probably be a requirement as well. That's a good point.
I think we talked about the comprehensive coverage at the beginning, and that's key because one of my colleagues mentioned the provision in the Act for submitting trades that wouldn't be accepted by any repository directly to the Commission, and that's probably something you don't want to get. So comprehensive coverage across the whole OTC swap landscape is important, and also scale. We see 6 million trades on a regular basis. So once these rules come into effect, I know there are some periods of sort of phase-in, but you're potentially going to get a huge amount of data, and then you're going to get it on a periodic basis. So the capability to handle the entire market is an important consideration.
We do have one last question. Oh, I'm sorry. Please, Mark, go ahead.
Just add to what the gentleman said. I would think there's probably more similarities than there are dissimilarities between the infrastructure and operations of a DCO or a DCM. In principle, applying best practices. I think staffing competency would also be key to add to the things that Bruce had just mentioned, which means there's going to have to be some face time between the regulator and the entity.
So one last question on a slightly different topic. We've spoken a lot about the commissions being able to reach into SDRs and form pictures, of an aggregate marketplace. Do you foresee any need for SDRs to communicate with each other? Should there be any requirement or voluntary agreements for SDRs to share information?
Well, I think it's in the best interest of everyone to work together, no matter how many SDRs there have, but in particular with the SDRs that are internationally based. So if, again, you're trying to get a global view of risk, just having, an efficient SDR program in the U.S. doesn't really solve the problem. So I think it's really the ability to coordinate within the U.S. and then certainly offshore.
And even from a process point of view, I would imagine that the SDRs are going to face similar types of issues and challenges both across countries and across product spaces. And so certainly there's going to be some scale economy just in certainly at least allowing and encouraging the SDRs to share with each other the benefits of their expertise on the process side. I don't mean just computer process, but even with respect to kind of the perhaps substantial regulation or market kind of oriented issues that they're going to face, which are going to have some connection across these contexts.
Just to add to that, I'd say differently, which would be nothing to prohibit that cooperation. I think would be helpful.
I sense yet another trade association being set up.
Okay, we want to end in a few more, about 5 minutes, but I had one question, and I apologize if this was answered, but maybe I didn't get from the discussion what most people's thoughts were, but and just to very quickly to kind of go around, do you view a core function of the swap data repository to include confirmation of trades as well as monitoring for life cycle events? And I know there was discussion about that, but I would just very quickly.
I think it depends what we mean by core function. I think confirmation is incredibly important. It should be a registered activity. I don't feel strongly whether you call it an SDR function or a CEF function or something else. It just needs to fit in somewhere into the Act. Whether the same entity needs to do both things, I think, is currently none of the offerings work on that basis. I don't feel it has to be the same company, but there obviously needs to be some sort of registration for confirmation.
Yeah.
Can you? Oh.
Yeah, no, I would say that the life cycling event data is important, right? So, certainly you talked about credit derivatives. When there's a credit event, they terminate. Succession events, the underlyings change their names. There's very much a life cycle that actually informs the position. And you have to follow that life cycle. And not all these events are confirmable in a legal contract sense. And I think sometimes, like a lot of the comments have referred to the trade confirmation service, and that that in an electronic form and linking things to wrappers. I think we've talked more widely about some other means of getting trade data to repositories. It's obvious from the Act that there's an obligation to confirm with both parties, and confirmation vehicles are great ways of doing that. But the repository, from my perspective, it is about aggregating that data set and maintaining that data set and making sure that what gets reported is an accurate and valid position. And life cycle events can't be totally ignored from that.
Okay, and just others very quickly.
I do believe it's a core component, but in addition to operating the warehouse for the energy commodities, it's one part. So confirmations, that's the first step. You need to make sure you have confirmed trades. Usually third parties doing that is probably the best way to achieve that, but then once it makes its way into the warehouse, maintaining life cycle events is going to be the next step for position reporting.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously multiple duties on a contract, and confirming them is one, and reporting it to an SDR is another, and there's many successful pieces of infrastructure around in the market, and we just believe that decision, it might be right to use one particular platform to do both, but it should be left to the market and the participants rather than the rules.
I believe the intent of the confirmation aspect in the bill is to confirm the trade details sent by the swap dealer or the major swap participant is accurate, not to confirm that the trade between the dealer and, say, the end user is matched and confirmed. So if it's the former, absolutely the SDR. If it's the latter, we need both sides of the trade.
I would just echo Ralph's comments.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think this determination should be asset class specific. I don't think it can be mandated. For example, in credit, 99% of the trades are confirmed there in the DTC, but that extra 1% cannot be there because that functionality does not exist. So the repository has to be able to get a larger set of data than that. The life cycle events, again, in credit, we designed it as such because it was needed, but in other asset classes, it is not needed. So therefore, I don't think we need to mandate it. So we need to be a bit more asset class specific in that respect.
Can I just come up back on Thanasis?
Yeah, very quickly.
Yeah, the only comment is that whether it's centrally done by a repository, I think, is a separate question in terms of this lifecycle maintenance, which is maybe the credit model where it is centralized, as opposed to some decentralized and some messaging around that, right? I think there are opportunities there. So but I think the real point I'm trying to make is to have accurate data, you have to understand lifecycle events.
Chester, did you want to say anything?
Well, I would just echo many of the comments of the participants. To the extent that there's sort of an economic issue with respect to confirmations, it seems to me the main issue is simply making sure that the data, to follow up on Stuart's point, making sure that the data integrity is there, which the confirmation, at some level, pieces of the confirmation process are important to. But then I think the more ministerial aspects of the confirmation process, those really ought to be associated with comparative advantage. And I think a number of the panelists pointed to that aspects of the confirmation, particularly to the extent that they involve end users, don't necessarily need to involve the SDR. So it seems to me that where the opportunity is for the commissions operating under Dodd-Frank is to be clear about which aspects of the confirmation process need to be linked to the SDRs.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I want to thank all the panelists. It was a very interesting and helpful discussion. We'll end this panel and we'll start up again at 11 o'clock with panel 2. Thank you again very much. If everyone wants to come in and take a seat, and we'll get started. Okay, let's get going. We want to start with our second panel today. This is going to focus on the mechanics of reporting data on swaps, and some of the topics we want to discuss at this panel are the types of data to be reported, the parties that would be responsible for reporting, and the reporting of life cycle events. Again, my name is Rick Schiltz. I'm Acting Director of our Division of Market Oversight at the CFTC. And joining me is Robert Cook from the Securities and Exchange Commission. And to begin this, why don't we go around the table and each of the panelists can introduce themselves and say where they're from, and then I think we have one that will be identifying himself from New York. So, yeah, press the button there and the red light will go on.
Nick Themelis, CIO Market Access. We're an institutional electronic trading venue for fixed income product, specific focus in credit.
Joe Glaze, Chief Risk Officer for Exelon Corporation. I'll be providing the end user viewpoint.
Bob Pickle, Executive Vice Chairman of ISDA, the International Swaps and Derivatives Association.
Stuart Macbeth, DTCC, General Manager of the Trade Information Warehouse.
Irina Leonova, CFTC Division of Market Oversight.
David Taylor, the team lead for the data record keeping and reporting requirements rulemaking at CFTC.
Heather Seidel, Division of Trading and Markets at the SEC.
David McKell, Division of Trading and Markets at the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Raf Pritchard, Head of Trioptima North America.
Mark Dixon, Chief Operating Officer of Evolution Markets.
Sunil Coutinho, CME Clearinghouse.
And lastly, from New York.
Jeremy Barnum from JP Morgan.
Okay, thank you. And as I noted for the first panel, we'd like everybody to have an opportunity to comment on each of the questions raised, but if we go on a little too long, I'll try to cut that short so we do get all the questions in during for this panel discussion, which we hope to end at 12:45. So with that, I think David will kick it off with the first question.
And I want to just briefly set a little background for this and some of the other questions. I was thinking, listening this morning, living in Washington, I suppose rubs off on you after a little while, but I will try not to put this question absolutely into the congressional category. But we might want to usefully remember as we do all these questions this morning, I think the repositories are going to need three basic stages or types of data, and we might separate these as we talk. Certainly they're going to need initial deal or transaction data. You might call this transaction event data. They're going to need post-deal data. Some would say life cycle data, events over the existence of the swap. You could call this transaction state data, if you like. They're probably going to need counterparty position data, mark-to-market data, collateral data, that sort of thing. And one thing that's been driving our thinking about the data that should be reported and how it should be reported is the use that regulators need to make of the data, at the end of this process. In a way, what data should be reported all derives from there. Worth remembering, regulators will need to do market and trade practice surveillance, enforcement, prudential supervision. Some will have resolution authority, monetary or currency authority, macroprudential systemic risk supervision, real-time reporting, and position limit supervision. To serve those purposes and some of the fundamental purposes of the legislation, including transparency and systemic risk mitigation, we have been considering the possible use of 3 unique identifiers regarding each swap. Another way to say that would be a unique required way of expressing data in 3 key fields in the data structure. A unique deal or transaction ID for this particular swap that would follow it over its whole life. A unique counterparty ID for each counterparty to the swap, and a unique product ID to say which bucket does this swap belong in. So having said that, a 3-part question: how could we best create these 3 types of unique ID? Who might be the entity that would create each of them? How would they be given to all the entities involved in the swap, the counterparties, the CEFs, the DCMs, the DCOs, the SDRs? And what are the benefits or potential obstacles to trying to create a system of unique IDs?
Hi, thanks, David. I'm speaking from our experience as a clearinghouse and as an exchange. We have had to address these challenges as well. When we talk about transaction identifiers, there are identifiers associated with different stages of a transaction. There is the execution part, and then there is the clearing part, and then each client on the 2 sides of the transaction would also like to trace these transactions to their own risk systems. So when we talk about transaction ID and uniqueness, I think the challenges one should consider are there are not just one identifier, there are several. What is important is an identifier that we would use as a clearinghouse for our purposes, and there would be a similar notion, I suppose, in a swap data repository for uncleared stuff. From the participant standpoint, it's very important for us to know the end participant as well, especially for cleared-only transactions. We record this. We actually maintain positions for these participants, and we provide multilateral netting within the clearing system. So it was almost essential for us to have this concept. From this perspective, we have to understand challenges of asset managers or money managers who are actually managing funds for multiple accounts. So it's important to address those challenges. And the third important thing is product identifier. Now, for the listed stuff or a large part of standardized stuff, this is actually quite simple. We have a mechanism of actually templating or creating contracts that predefine the standardized terms, and then we identify those terms that are negotiated. As we move into the over-the-counter space, there are a lot more flexible elements. So templating or contract creation becomes a challenge. So one way to address that is actually to type class your derivatives into different classes, and then within those asset classes, go specifically into those areas that are treated by the market participants as a standard. So they are not negotiated; they are kept intact. But the negotiated aspects are the ones that are such as coupon or start date, termination date, etc. The industry itself has encouraged this effort, so we see that happening in credit, and we have adopted the same standards. For rates, we see the market transacting in such a manner, so we've created a templating mechanism that helps us actually classify these derivatives. Again, what I'm trying to communicate here is not as easy as to come up with just one identifier for a product. We need to actually take into account how the transactions take place. And then in a cleared world, That happens almost automatically because we have to standardize a few terms in order to process them in a standard manner. But for an uncleared world, there can be a few parameters that are actually negotiated between participants.
I think that's a great point mentioning the cleared world there, because we find ourselves at the coming together of the exchange-listed cleared world and the OTC swap world. And I mentioned in the last panel the diversity of the landscape across all the different asset classes and all the different instrument types within that, and that's really the challenge facing the product ID part of this question. I think, you know, in our interest rate repository, we see 3.6 million live contracts outstanding, and we see a rate of new interest rate swaps coming in of around 3,600 a day. And of those, about the most popular currency is dollars, and that's about a third of them with $1,200 swaps. And then about half of those are on round dates, and half of them are forward or odd dates. So that's getting down to the most popular forward date is the 10-year swap. We see about 200 of those a day. And then even there is, as sort of mentioned, different rate bases or tenors that you can put them on. So there's really only 100 or so completely identifiably standard 10-year swaps going on a particular day. And I think it's worth just observing that contrast between the listed markets and the OTC swap markets when we address these challenges of trying to provide standard product IDs.
So I'd say in terms of, you know, the unique deal, you need to put that up front. That needs to be, you know, created at the point of, or as near to execution as you can. And so, you know, there's the CEF vehicle potentially for doing that. There's the confirmation, you know, wrapper vehicle. The CEF may use a confirm service, you know, itself directly. You know, that unique reference could be applied there. Also, we talked in the earlier panel about this idea of some of those trades that aren't electronically confirmable being, you know, linked. And again, we talked, you know, high in the chain. The same providers, I think, that provide confirmation services would want to support those kind of transactions and provide some of the confirmation services that exist today. You know, had origins as checkout platforms. And I think they're very valid points to start creating, you know, unique identifiers for a transaction that then can be carried down the transaction stack, you know, through layers of infrastructure. You know, currently we provide one when it gets registered in the warehouse. You know, that is well used because, you know, that is the value of the unique ID. There's this sense of a common reference, and that is being used, you know, throughout the market, you know, for individual transactions. So, but, you know, the essence to my mind is, you know, you have to do this early if everybody's going to share that. It has to be high in the process. SDRs could do it, but also these confirmation providers and execution facilities. So, sorry, I was going to...
As people go on with that, let me add one extra aspect to what you were just saying, and you know, others could respond. If the idea is to get one unique, let's start with the deal ID, used by everyone in the swap space, obviously a question is who creates it and how is it transmitted, you know, to everybody who has to use it. For instance, is it workable for the data repository to do that? And if so, is that early enough in the process, and how do they send it back out? Just add that to the question as you go forward.
Yeah, so that practically that's what happens in the credit market today. The issue we will have to contend with is how we would link that back to the CEF. You know, if the CEF sits above that. Having said that, there are some back population techniques that are used. It's not a technical impossibility. So again, you know, it could be done at the SDR level. The SDR hopefully will have advantages of, you know, completeness. So again, you know, to the uniqueness point, actually being the kind of golden source of that, you know, that is a possibility. But, you know, I also want to kind of mention those confirmation and middleware providers that are really at the tie-up point. to the extent that's not itself considered an SDR. So, and I think, like personally, it's quite a big change for people to flow that information through. In general, there is practice. I know, Jeff Gooch was in the earlier panel. His service, he has references in his service. He uses those. They're market wire IDs as well. So, and people do internalize those and use them as the common reference when they bilaterally trade and bilaterally process thereafter through their life. So, some of that exists, and it is usable. Unique counterparty is important. It's difficult, I think. There's clearly a lot of data providers in the counterparty world, but I guess my experience with the regulators as an SDR has kind of suggested that they do want relatively rich counterparty information. Clearly we need proper validation of who that is, but the actual ask goes beyond that and starts talking about who is affiliated, with that party, even goes to credit support annex terms or guarantees between companies. So it's a very complex reference data set. I suspect, therefore, it's a different data service. Again, practically, we've addressed it by having contracts with our customers, and when we talked about that compliance thing, I talked about kind of KYC and AML stuff. We do feel the need to know our customers, and we have a set of data on them which we use. We've got kind of this 1,700 clients, 17,000 accounts. That's not going to get you the whole derivative market, but it gets somewhere. But there is going to need to be a source. Now, how you resolve what source that will be, I think, is a complex question. There's a lot of commercial interest to that. I'm probably not the best person to establish creating that. I can. DTCC has a counterparty reference data business. I can promote that, but I think it's kind of a complicated world. And then you talked about unique product identifiers, and I think that's a question of actually what level of granularity you want to go to. So at some level there are probably some standard contracts that are known. So with Thanasis in the room, there's these kind of standard North American contracts for credit derivatives. Most people know what that default swap is, and it has a strong market meaning. ISDA certainly has a strong position in terms of setting those standards. But I guess I've seen it at a slightly different level, and it depends a little bit on the use. Trades or products characterized almost by attributes that they carry. So, if a product had exposure to credit underlyings, it would be put in the credit a credit category. You'd have a product type, so between OTC, exchange, securities. You'd have a series of attributes that basically build product descriptors, but you have a defined set of attributes and a set of values that people use, and that tends to enable any product to fit somewhere on that matrix. Because the problem always is the non-standard product. So whereas the standard trade has a market name, more bespoke trades tend to have proprietary names issued by their marketing firms, and less standardization.
Yes, I was going to say that I think you've certainly identified the key pieces of the identifiers, but in effect it's really a string of all that information that identifies, particularly in the pure bilateral non-cleared world, what that particular trade is. Once you put it into a clearinghouse, one of those variables, if you will, is more or less fixed for that transaction, and you can look across transactions for trades with that clearinghouse of a certain type, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's the notion that you'd have to think of, and that's, I think, different from, and people talked about CUSIP type numbers, that type of thing. It is not a standardized number in that sense. I mean, every particular trade effectively will have a different identifier, and that's been an issue that, for the past, I would say, good 10 years, if not more, either the dealers and their customers or some of the vendors that have developed, such as the ones around the table and others, have tried to wrestle with how we go about that. So there's a lot of learning there, there's a lot of scars there, I suspect, that you can draw from to understand how to best put together a deal identifier that is meaningful giving you the right level of information. I think to Stuart's point, you could find yourself getting into an awful lot of detail on the products themselves that frankly at the end of the day isn't necessarily all that much useful if you know it's a credit deal of a certain type, broadly speaking. So I think it's finding that right mix is the right focus.
Having an unambiguous identifier is just ideal, because if it's issued at the time by the SDR, it's sort of contemporaneously issued by the SDR, it also helps with the person who's doing reporting saying, I fulfilled my reporting duty or obligation because I have your identifier number back, and I'm storing it now as my trade ID, your trade ID. That really helps end users communicate with everybody.
I think
one of the one of the things that hasn't been mentioned yet, which I think is an important piece of that, although I think Stuart alluded to it a little bit, is the sort of question of the balance between timeliness and completeness and precision. And so if you go back to the three purposes, if not more, that are related to the reporting, one is the post-trade transparency, post-trade price transparency mandate. And then there are requirements also related to systemic risk oversight, essentially the ability of regulators with systemic risk mandates to look into the SDRs for purposes of really performing almost like an independent risk management function for the market. And the requirements for those two functions are quite different, and I think many of us in the market have struggled at different points to try to do those two different things out of the same data source. So I think being clear, I think collectively in our minds about that distinction is going to be very important. So what I mean by that specifically is that, I imagine that when the rulemaking is done, for the most liquid, most heavily traded products, the post-trade reporting requirement is likely to look sort of not dissimilar to what TRACE looks like today for corporate bonds, meaning it's going to be of the order of an hour or less after the trade is done, if not significantly faster. And so I think all of us know that there are certain aspects of the post-trade enrichment process that don't get done until much later in the day. And if we design the process so that it is a requirement that all of those things be populated before the post-trade reporting can be done, then you're going to have the policy objectives come into conflict. So you have to design a paradigm that allows the post-trade transparency reporting requirement to be met kind of quickly with a somewhat reduced set of data, which is really in reality the only data that you're likely to care about for that purpose, which is basically size and price and the thing that traded, and then allow for further enrichment later in the workflow. And I would argue for not trying too hard to try to reconcile the flow data that comes out of the post-trade reporting with the ultimate kind of gold position data that you're going to use for risk management. I think you just have to accept that there are occasionally going to be differences, and you have to trust that if institutions are using the SDRs for their own reconciliation purposes for risk management, then that should suffice for the regulatory community, because otherwise you might create a huge amount of overhead around that reconciliation for relatively little benefit.
Mark. I think there's a couple of questions, and the first one is whether or not, what's the minimum data set you need? And I think one of the things to consider is the asset class and the type of transaction. In particular, allowing for uniqueness and allowing for some supplemental data to be added to that to help clarify. And I think an interesting point was just raised, which is when do you actually need that data? Because at certain times of the day you may need one data set, and at the end of the day, post-reconciliation, you may need another data set. And the last thing I would say is some type of standard is going to be essential. You have two challenges. You have legacy products. That's one. That's going to be a heavy lift. And then the new products, I think, are much more straightforward, and no small part will come as an outcome of trying to kick the legacy can around for a while to come up with the right solution.
I'll just add one little point to that. I think I totally agree with what Jeremy said there, but it's also, on a practical note, a lot of the identifiers that are in use at the moment in our exposure risk management service, we've cleaned up thousands of legal entities as we receive that data, and practical steps have been taken to address these problems in the market. One thing that does happen quite a lot is that when data gets passed around, the identifiers from the venues that are out there are used a lot. We get a lot of DTCC IDs in our data, and we pass our tropsomer IDs back out to the market. So in terms of you can refer to a trade by one of the identifiers that is already out electronically a venue identifier, adds a lot of value and can provide a practical solution to some of these standardization problems.
Let me ask one follow-up.
Yeah, just
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to add quickly to what Raf said, just that to echo that really across almost all of the questions that have been asked, I think it's important to realize the degree of evolution that certain segments of the OTC market have undergone in, say, the last 2.5 or 3 years, such that, in fact, I would say about 80 or 90% of these questions have, in one way, shape, or form, already been answered, reasonably robustly. There's probably some cleanup that needs to be done around certain issues and some centralization and some specification of universal standards. But to what you might find to be a surprising extent, many of these issues have already been sort of resolved, maybe in some cases in a commercial way that creates certain standards conflicts, but less than you might think. So there are already kind of solutions in the wild in many cases.
Let me ask one follow-up before we leave this, specifically on counterparty ID. If we set up a unique ID for the two legal entities that are the two counterparties to the swap, so that that field could be expressed in a unique way, as Stuart and I think a couple of other folks alluded to earlier, one of the things regulators are going to need to do is going to be able to aggregate up to the parents or affiliates of the two counterparties in order to do various kinds of systemic risk management. Is it workable to get separately from that one unique ID of the counterparty to get affiliation data into the SDR? It would be in different parts of the data structure, but it would be there so that regulators could do aggregation, or is there a better way to do that? How do you deal with also getting the affiliation data? And it's, here we have both potential or existing repositories, and we also have counterparties. So it'd be nice to hear from both sides of that.
Generally speaking, we don't try to make the code itself intelligent. If there's a counterparty and parent relationship, it's usually some other software that tries to aggregate the relationship, if you will. So typically, the counterparty ID is just an unambiguous single tag for a counterparty that the trading systems or some other aggregation hierarchy assembles, and somebody else has to declare what the relationships are between the parent and the sub. So again, from our standpoint, generally speaking, we just usually don't try to make a string code that identifies it within the code. That's usually difficult.
Right.
But may I follow up, Stan? I'm sorry, but based on what level of legal entity reporting you assign the unique ID, you actually impact how you do aggregation. Do we do it on top parent level? Do we do it on legal entity level? Do we do it on trading desk level?
So we operate on legal entity level in terms of our data. We do have a set of reference data, around counterparties that we use. In the short term, we expect we would have to enrich that. So something like we have a family grouping, so we can roll some of the data up, within a family and present that. But we don't have an exhaustive data set of all affiliates or the nature of their relationship or ownership. And practically, that really sounds like to me a service that you will have to in effect subscribe to, really to keep that current, right? So it is the way I see that counterparty data set. But there's certain things that I think we're going to have to keep, and so certainly knowing who our customers, regulators are, and therefore who we can report certain data to and have a dialogue with, is relatively close to us, and therefore almost proprietary to the business we do. But I think ultimately there's a sense of external pricing, external sourcing for that, for some of this data. The other question is, whom exactly will aggregate at what level? So, if the SDR is aggregating, or the commissions decide that they would appoint somebody to be an aggregator amongst the SDRs, you would then expect that SDR to actually be sourcing a lot of that data and probably consolidating on that basis and presenting it to the commission. I'm sure the commission will have access to its own information, but it is slightly a function of the model. Again, without repeating the earlier panel, we talked about fragmentation and all those kinds of issues, and they move the burden somewhat between the commissions and the SDR potentially.
Actually, we in some ways have to maintain or understand the relationships from two purposes, from two perspectives. One is from a risk management perspective. We have to understand the relationship between entities, and if they are affiliates, we have to look at their aggregate risk. And the second would be from a market surveillance perspective, because we have certain obligations to our regulator, and we have to report on that. So from these two perspectives, we do monitor relationships, and we do aggregate at different levels.
I think TriOptima, would echo what DTCC said. Our experience is very much of our exposure management service working at the legal entity level, and I think it's, in times of crisis, that's what people are interested in, what is specific legal entity exposure. It's very important to say exactly what you mean if you are aggregating it across legal entities. What is the basis for doing that?
Okay, if no more questions or comments on that one, I'll turn it over to Heather for the next question.
Thank you. This question sort of goes to, and we've touched on it in several of your answers. There's a requirement in the Act that that information be reported, and I guess sort of one of the baseline questions is what type of information should be required to be reported, and sort of across asset classes, different asset classes, cleared versus uncleared, maybe your thoughts on, sort of what happens today and how can that translate into a rule that will be in place, talking about the types of information that would be reported. And I'm not talking about sort of real-time reporting out to the public, but reporting into the depository.
Well, I think go ahead, Raf. Go ahead.
I think that question starts with the comprehensive view of the swap data repository. It is, we think of it, the OTC swap landscape, as a two-dimensional sort of plot with the asset class category going across the top, say credit, equity, rates, FX, and then the instrument type vertically with simple swaps and more complex options and hybrids and structures. And it's really important, as we've discussed, that it's comprehensive, and every trade in the OTC swap world has a place on that landscape and can be captured by an SDR and aggregated together. And so it's important to catch some data that is the key financial details of all those swaps across the landscape. And then where there are more standardized trades, where the templates exist, capture that data or a reference to that data at another electronic venue. But I believe capturing something across some key financial terms for every trade across the whole landscape, no matter where it is an important piece of designing the data that a SDR should receive.
I can't.
Sorry, Jeremy, did you want to go ahead?
No, the only thing I was going to say is, I think there are some of these arenas where there are tensions between different benefits that we're trying to achieve, and there are some of them where there aren't. And those are the easy ones, so we should sort of celebrate those. So I think in the case of reporting to regulators that have an enforcement mission or a systemic risk oversight mission, when that information is kept confidential and is simply being consumed by that regulator for the purpose of performing their regulatory function, then I think the answer to the question what information should be supplied is quite simple. It's everything. And the only really contrary weight there is where there's a bunch of superfluous garbage that just makes the job harder. But that's a fairly low-level technical issue. I think fundamentally, if you just take the credit markets as an example right now, the DTCC has, a whole bunch of stuff in there, a lot of which arguably most of the time most people wouldn't care about. But for the purpose of, doing systemic risk oversight, which has to really get down to the actual core economic contractually binding terms of the deal, you have to err on the side of completeness, and the cost of doing that, in my view, is relatively low, since there's no real risk of accidentally disclosing things that could be damaging to market liquidity, et cetera. So I think the carve-out of the post-trade transparency reporting in Heather's question is critical. When you reintroduce that, then you have some interesting things that you have to weigh.
So our experience has been that different regulators have asked for different data. The markets regulators very detailed data, and in essence they've needed complete confirmation style records because they really want. Some of the work, the impression I've got is they've been looking at some of the liquidity aspects, in the market, and we've had to, we've done some public disclosure about some liquidity analysis, but we've had to get to a fair level of degree of specificity in separating pools of contracts to say that actually, those are a grouping that go together. So, we found that some of the markets regulators needs are very, very granular. They've also, at times have had kind of higher level needs, wanting to understand positions and transactions, not necessarily at the level of price sensitivity, which maybe the liquidity analysis was trying to look at, but just really understanding who's holding positions and how they move over time. Prudential regulators have typically come in and asked us for information about positions for their regulatees or positions relating to an entity that they oversee in some way, or exposures in amongst a group of entities that they oversee relating to a reference entity. And then the systemic stuff we've seen, or the stuff to central banks, has again been more aggregate, less specific, and the latter two. The emphasis on the mark-to-market probably is more important to the prudential and the systemic risk regulators wanting to understand the total exposures. Again, that links back into the collateral conversation that was had earlier. So that's been the practical experience from us. And so I think when you are kind of an SDR, you kind of have to go to the deepest requirement and work up, and so we think trade event feeds that are sourced from very high quality records are important, and we think some of the daily mark to market valuation stuff is important.
From our perspective, we do have a division within the CME group dealing with regulations. So from our perspective, I think what we have an existing relationship with our regulator. The kinds of information are what, who, when, and where. That is at transaction time. It's very important to track that. So we monitor that ourselves to make sure our markets are functioning very well and to preserve the market integrity. Then from a post-trade perspective, I think most important thing is ownership, transfers, where do the trades go, the state of the trade, and then finally, from a risk perspective, the mark-to-market, or at the end of the day, what are the monies actually settled. So we provide this function from within the CME, and we share this with our regulator. As far as swap data repositories are concerned, I do understand the challenge where these are four uncleared swaps. For this population, I would think that you would have similar requirements, especially from the transaction side. You would need to know, where and how and who actually executed the transaction. Of course, it's subject to all the confidentiality issues or privacy issues across jurisdictions, which Thanasis was talking about in the previous panel. As far as the positions or the owners of the trade, I think, again, the challenges are who is the counterparty, and one issue with repositories is they're maintained as trades. We in the clearinghouse find it very easy because we do multilateral netting. We can actually communicate net position risk or net risk. So those are the challenges to deal with.
To echo a bit of what has been said, especially what Jeremy said, I mean, the fact of the matter is, this data has traditionally existed. It's been available in many cases to the individual regulator of the regulated entity, to the extent you're talking about a bank or other regulated entity. What the goal, as I understand it, is to allow a regulator, whether it's a market regulator or a systemic risk regulator, to have the information to connect the dots, to see trends in trading that might be relevant from an enforcement standpoint, and to see buildup in risk that will certainly be relevant from a systemic risk standpoint. So I think certainly in the conversations I've been involved in with regulators over the last few years, there's been a real willingness to provide access to that information for those two purposes. And so we can build on that, utilizing the structure that's been put in place now across credit, interest rates, and more recently equities from the data repositories.
If I could jump in, I wanted to connect this discussion to what I think is a broader question that is relevant to a lot of what this panel is going to be talking about, and frankly the other panels as well, which is how we connect the dots, as you're talking about, not just within the derivatives markets, but across other markets. And to what extent can we develop a system at the end of which we're able to look across markets through where underliers are the same, and to look at issues of control, where you have, and this is getting back to the earlier line of questioning, where you have parties who are under common control, even if they are separate legal entities. That might be of interest from a regulatory surveillance perspective. And in the equity markets, we have a number of initiatives, including a large trader reporting initiative and a consolidated audit trail initiative. And one thing that might be interesting is to think about how to connect up the data elements we're talking about here to those other initiatives, and recognizing that time is short and we can't create the perfect system all at once. I think one question I'd raise is, assuming we know where we want to get eventually, what can we be doing now to make sure that even if we can't create the perfect system out of the box, that we're able to get there efficiently in a relatively short period of time, to be able to have the facility to surveil across markets, and so that we don't have to spend another 2 years or 3 years dealing with the lack of interoperability, for example, between different reporting systems because we didn't think of it at the beginning. I'd be interested in that, in your how that feeds into your thinking about what types of data we ought to be soliciting at the beginning of this process.
I guess I'll jump in there and see where things go. It's a daunting task. It's daunting enough to get the information in the derivatives world, in a consistent format. In fact, I think we're farther along than other markets are likely to be. If you looked at the Lehman Brothers report from Valukas, and you look for information, his aspects on OTC derivatives, he said only two things he said about OTC derivatives. First of all, he said their records for OTC derivatives were actually far better than existed in other product classes. So in a sense, they were further ahead. And further, they commented that the tension that exists in the bilateral relationship, particularly where collateral is involved, creates a natural competitive tension between those two parties, and as a result, their risk is more effectively managed. So that's almost as an aside. It's not really relevant to the data point. But I think the key thing is that the information in Lehman Brothers was, on OTC derivatives, was better than other areas. You know, and I think part of the discussion in this panel later on may get into questions of standards, and obviously we can talk a little bit about the FPML standard, which provides some of that consistency, a large part of it, but I think you also want to make sure that if people have in place other mechanisms that provide information in an effective way, you don't undermine what currently exists. So those are a couple of thoughts.
You know, I think the question was asked, what can we do to achieve more faster? And at the risk of being a little bit controversial here, I think, frankly, the tension that no one has yet mentioned explicitly is a tension that surrounds the question of who's going to pay for it. And what I mean by that is that, you know, a lot of people around the table have alluded to the fact that a lot of these problems have largely, or in some cases completely, been solved, and in some cases by more than one commercial provider. And at the same time, a lot of these kinds of questions are questions that large banks ask for themselves every day. So the question of, I need to do multi-asset class, high-level aggregate risk management is, of course, a question that every single large bank has to do every day as part of their risk management function. And the kinds of technology challenges and reference data challenges and legal entity to affiliate mapping questions, I mean, these are questions that all of us who've been part of that kind of stuff over the last 10 or 20 years have lived with, you know, quite painfully in many cases for a long time. And there have been, as is well known, initiatives created in the market. You know, one random example is the RED initiative surrounding, you know, the standardization and kind of certification of legal entity names for usage in the credit derivatives market, but there are many other similar examples. And the question that just comes out of that is, you know, if you kind of re-specify it and rebuild it from scratch in the sort of context which is regulatory compliance, you're kind of going to be crowding out all of the existing private sector solutions, and it will take you much longer. On the other hand, if you embrace the existing private sector solutions, you are getting into the game of potentially picking winners among sort of commercial competitors, which is also very tricky. So I don't have an answer to that question, but I think that if the priority is to get more done faster, the focus should be on finding a way to leverage the existing commercial solutions in a way that's kind of, you know, fair, for lack of a better term, because there are many solutions there, and the profit motive does, you know, produce fast innovation and better solutions faster.
Yeah, the comment I was going to make is actually I don't think for credit derivatives or equity derivatives it's too difficult from a perspective of instrument identifiers. You know, they do exist, and I think they can be fairly readily aggregated across market. I think, you know, the complexity is really going to be about understanding the derivative and understanding what that might mean about pricing, you know, potentially. So I don't think the cross markets view, as long as you've got access to the full set of data, you know, is the issue. But having like the harder issues potentially are the completeness of the data. You know, particularly you know, global markets, not all traded, you know, within the US boundaries. There's a stretch to get that, and you know, the aggregation is probably the challenge more than actually the attribute relating to a security, right? You know, that's probably not the challenge.
I'd agree with what Jeremy said. I think the truth is that the banks have largely solved a lot of the counterparty identifier and relationship problems for themselves. They've had to do that as part of their effective counterparty risk management. Now, naturally, like a lot of the OTC space, they've all done it themselves differently, adopting their own conventions or with their own pieces of technology. But there is a lot of value there already in the market, and finding ways to leverage that is probably going to yield benefits for getting this solved quickly.
Anything more? Let's move on to the next question, David.
Sorry. Let me tee up something that's maybe at the heart of the data reporting thing, which is what data should we ask people to report? Let me pose the question this way. If the commission, rules of the two commissions ended up requiring reporting of all the fields needed to fully confirm the trade or the deal, and by confirm, I mean, I guess in the classic sense of both sides have matched every detail of the deal, including at least a minimum specified list of fields. Do you all think that would be sufficient to fulfill the regulatory and other purposes for which the data is needed? If that's not the way to do it, what's a better way?
And can I just add to that question as you're answering, sort of that also raises the question of when should the reporting occur, and sort of should it occur when a trade is done, after confirmation, the full-blown confirmation that David was talking about, or some other time. So sort of as you're thinking through, I guess that's one of the the other questions as to, given the purposes of the reporting, when should it occur?
And it also based on where the transaction happened, whether it's cleared and centrally executed, or whether it is bilateral negotiated transaction.
In response to the kind of when, the data, the leaner the data, the faster you can get an accurate report out. The richer the data set you require, the more risk you have of misreporting data too early because it hasn't gone through some e-confirm process or something else that helps you validate that you have a good trade and it's not an out trade. So, if you go too fast, you run the risk of a lot of out trades getting resolved or sort of a lot of adjustments to the transactional data set. But if you wait, and traditionally, I don't think it's any more than two to 4 business days for standard products that you can have a fairly complete confirmed trade that you can in fact submit. Now again, this goes to the level of sophistication of the entity, because again, from the end user perspective, some people, you could have a deal with the municipality where you have to wait till the commission meets next week to get a transaction confirmed. I mean, going to the extreme, that's sort of but a standard trade in sort of standard products should be just a couple of business days, and you can get a fairly complete, robust data set that's confirmation quality, I think. But again, to the extent that you're dealing with further and further away from people who sort of transact on a daily basis or a high volume basis, now you're looking at a totally different class of participant who may have to have the lawyers figure out the rest of the contract details before they can adequately fill out a form. So, but again, I think there's a lot of different worlds here.
I should maybe clarify one aspect of the question. I didn't mean to imply, although it's an interesting question, should each deal be fully confirmed before it comes into the SDR? That's worth answering too, but what I meant more was, should each party be required to report all of the fields that would be needed to do confirmation? I'm not getting yet to the question of, has it been done yet, if that makes sense?
I think to that point, though, it's important to answer. We have to understand where that is to answer the when. You run the risk, and there's a price to pay for that, that if you get it too early, you don't have the information you need. There's a price to pay, or a penalty, if you will, if you get it too late because it's not actionable. And then what do you do in between, which is a reconciliation process where you say, oops, that's an erroneous transaction, now we just squared it away, it's correct. And so it seems to me that you go kind of as late in the life cycle as possible, where you say there's a reasonable assurance here that this has been done. Then the data set can float up. It also poses an interesting question if you're trying to do it in more real time, and you're trying to actively run a liquid and transparent market, then what is the intervention of the regulator in the middle of that trading activity, for lack of a better way to describe it, and then now what? And what's the trickle-down effect of uncertainty that you don't know that someone's going to reach in? So I think the market participants who understand the rule sets, particularly at exchange basis for exception, because each exchange runs it a little bit differently, being familiar with that's helpful. And I think it goes back to asset classes again and the types of transactions. And that's probably the best place to start, because each one of those tends to be a little bit different.
I think going back to the earlier point about the two sort of competing objectives of price transparency versus systemic risk monitoring, from the perspective of a software service provider, it's really important to be clear what the requirement is if we're trying to design the data architecture and answer these questions. Those two requirements set up the most amount of tension to try to solve both of those with the same set of answers to the same questions. I think from Trautmann's perspective, we're more on the sort of systemic risk monitoring end, and answering the question in that scope, we would then work backward from what's the top level aggregation report you want to see. That's the important data to capture for every single trade across the landscape. Then if it is a standardized trade, capture either a reference to another electronic venue where it's matched or that full data set. But and then any other identifiers that it has in other venues around the market are very valuable to capture as references.
So I think
just one,
Jeremy,
just one brief thing. Sorry.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Sorry, Rob. One brief thing. I think the question was asked, what should each party be required to submit? And I think one thing that we feel strongly about, which we think should be relatively uncontroversial just for the sake of efficiency, is that individual market participants should be able to satisfy their reporting requirements by leveraging some piece of market infrastructure which is serving some other purpose, and have that piece of market infrastructure do the reporting for them. So I think there was some mention before of middleware confirmation services. If that service provides a reporting facility, then it should be possible to meet the reporting requirement by establishing that you've submitted your trade to that service. In the same way, those services often submit to the SDRs, and similarly, that should constitute satisfying the requirement. I assume that's obvious, but I thought it was worth saying, since obviously that will avoid a lot of duplication of submission and will leverage existing efficiencies in the market.
For clear trades, what we do is, we do at submission time, we capture the trades. We also capture its life cycle throughout the process of clearing. And we maintain a holistic view from that standpoint, and we provide it to our regulator. So I think we see ourselves continuing to do that for the cleared world. For the uncleared world, I do agree that to make it efficient for market participants, it's best to actually use not just one, but any execution platform. If you have one, if they can report, then that essentially captures the match. For things that are done over paper or more manual, that becomes an issue. So I think that's where the crux of the question is. What where does the match happening for paper-related transactions? I suppose that's where you were coming from, whether they should report, each party should individually report because there's no electronic.
So I just say, I think we've said this, but the full legal record and the minimum, it sounds very plausible. I think to Jeremy's point, using existing infrastructure makes a lot of sense. The when, and Irina came in and talked about whether it was how it was executed, and I think you'll find that some of these services are actually used even by electronic execution venues, and in essence they will have the venue submitting almost a pre-match record. They very much think they're then in the routing and legal wrapper business, not so much in the matching business. And so you will see kind of more timeliness through that process. And in general, the latency in the confirmation process is relatively low for non and pretty compliant with the non-real-time requirement. I think there is another thing as well in that we've talked a little bit, and maybe Sunil's talked about cleared and uncleared separately, and the requirements are, I think, fairly consistent in the Act across the two. That they should go through the same types of reporting process and reporting requirements. Although I think CCPs can register as SDRs, right? I think that was a statement in the Act somewhere. So so there are again back to back to the overall model, again, some of these providers that act as these middlewares, will feed clearing platforms, multiple clearing platforms potentially. So that model can also accommodate some cleared trades too.
Yeah, I was going to add that at some level the easiest thing is just to dump the confirmation details on you, but that raises the question of too much data in your laps, and how do you weed through that and get if we accept that it's to be looking at enforcement and systemic risk monitoring, how do you weed through that to get the right information? So I think it's almost a question back to you. What do you need, particularly where we've got systems like the DTCC system on credit derivatives, the reconciliations that Trioptima has, anything that gets developed in a CEF type platform. The information, I should say, the data is going to be there. The question really is, what is the meaningful information that you want to have?
Can I add one final thing? Just something that's come up with some regulators with us is the idea of a quality standard on the data. So you could imagine, you talked about when we get it and potentially pre-matched, a repository would actually flag the trade as unmatched at that point, and that could be communicated to the regulator so they understood the quality of data that they had, and potentially any kind of matching that had been done to a point in time. It's just as a add-on.
One quick follow-up to a point somebody made earlier, talking about paper transactions. This is a small point, but maybe an important one. I think we've sort of been assuming that, I don't know if this category exists, but that even, if a counterparty is doing swaps in his basement in his bathrobe, he's going to have a PC. And he's going to keep records in it, so that in fact all of the reporting by everybody, no matter how bespoke, can be electronic, and just would be electronic, even if it's from a PC over the internet to the SDR. Is there anything wrong with that assumption? I mean, can we assume there literally is not any paper?
Well, I guess it depends on what your meaning of electronic is. Yes, I think, yes, these days a lot of the, if not all, and Jeremy and the others can talk more specifically in terms of how they run their business. Yeah, the communication, the emails, PDFs, the information goes back and forth. There may ultimately be a signature of some sort, maybe an electronic signature on that confirmation. So there is that type of electronic record. I guess what we're anticipating, I think we've done work on, as ISDA and the repositories and the clearinghouses and others have done it as well, is to go to that next level of rich electronic information that is actually usable and manipulable, so that you can run reports and analyze it. So yes, it is. I think for the vast majority, you will have electronic records. People may print those out, put them in a file somewhere, but there is that electronic back and forth. But I think the real focus would be to go to that next level of electronic.
Yeah, I think the PDF comment is kind of well made, right? So, some contracts can be confirmed electronically in 9 fields. Some, contracts exist as 100-page documents, but in general they're sent by fax, and at that point they turn into something electronic. And so but really to actually have data that you can analyze, you will need to pull out some fields from those, and potentially that isn't a process that runs like that today in the market necessarily.
Sorry, we would just add to that. We totally agree that at the tail of the market where the highly bespoke trades are, for example, our exposure management solution allows you to actually upload the PDF of the confirm, so the other side of the trade can view it online, and that's obviously not ideal, but that works for the very, very exotic end of the business.
Okay, I think we'll move on to the next question. Heather?
I guess it's sort of a follow-up question on what we just sort of got into, the question about if reporting was required to be in electronic form and not PDF, as you noted, but some sort of manipulable, usable electronic form, how would that impact, the current practice, and is that something that should be required, and if so, how does that sort of fit into the different types of transactions?
And if I could add one aspect to that, Ask Raf to start with it because I think we had earlier conversation about this. If it's, how to put this, if it is possible for the repositories to accept data in whatever form it's sent, so long as there's, every line of text is a different field, is that a potential solution to this?
Okay, yeah, there's a couple of questions there. I think to the earlier point, where you're covering the whole landscape, some trades are electronically confirmed in large volumes on very evolved platforms. Others are traded in much smaller numbers and more complex and may still be on a PDF. But our experience, looking at the 6 million trades that we regularly reconcile across the market, is that there is a core set of key financial identifiers that you can capture in all cases, just the notional of the trade and the currency of the trade and the tenor of the trade, that sort of thing. And that can be record-based electronic capture. If it's a very complex trade, then you might have some unstructured form for the rest of the data. And that's how we've covered how we've managed to combine both the standardized trades and the more complex ones in a single central platform for exposure management. And then the second part of the question, I guess, David, is where you then request those fields to be captured. Can you allow some flexibility in how the respondent submits them? And our experience of that is that you have to tell him he can't send it as a PDF. It has to be some sort of record-based, one-row, line-item-based submission. But the advantage is to get it to leverage some automated piece of infrastructure that they already have. And typically it's actually advantageous to get an automated extract from an existing piece of infrastructure, rather than something that has had to be manually massaged with the potential for introducing errors that brings.
From our perspective, I think our concerns are not necessarily the reporting. Our concerns are essentially if there is a data repository, then it's open, fair, and transparent access. That's I think very important. The second thing is we don't want the data repository in effect to impede on innovation. So things that a clearing model can do always can provide services. So we don't want an external, if there is a data repository, to impede that. And in order to be less disruptive, I think if there is a data repository, it should be open to receiving multiple formats. There is a difference between reporting things into the data repository versus providing a view to the regulators. So from the regulator standpoint, of course, you want everything to be easy to access and view and analyze. But as far as preventing disruptions to the marketplace, it should actually be open to accepting multiple formats rather than imposing one on them.
And I also think that any complex deal that may really reside at best in a PDF, if you have to satisfy some requirement of putting a notional out there, at least there's some kind of safe harbor that this is your best estimate of fulfilling that requirement, so that somebody doesn't come along later and say, well, I reread the contract and that notional you put down really does not meet the requirements. So again, from an end user standpoint where things can get really complicated, you'd also like to have sort of a best efforts safe harbor, for lack of a better word, that says you've attempted to model this thing given the framework limitations to satisfy the reporting obligation.
I'd just like to build on that point because I think it's very important that certain transactions are going to be subject to delivery, and delivery can be adjusted, and that doesn't mean that that was an erroneous or improper behavior of a transaction. It kind of is what it is. And so therefore you need some type of audit trail, if you will, that can link modifications to certain data fields, particularly volume as one example. That you have a look back where you can go in and adjust the volume. That can also be a bit difficult when those transactions become quasi-transparent. Someone is now acting on that information thinking that it isn't subject to variation, and therefore you can get some distortions in the market wherein somebody thinks something was quote-unquote mispriced. So I think it's important to take a category and kind of park that in the box and say, really, what do we want to do until it's done and dusted? And maybe it is you don't do anything with it other than go on record to say that this is subject to change. And once it is delivered, then I think it's straightforward. Again, I would just say the audit trail of modification might be important, but then that just increases the data set that you have to look at as well.
Kind of along the lines of what Mark was just talking about, for what life cycle events should be captured in the SDR, and are there any life cycle events that would not need to be captured, and what timeframes should those be input into the SDR?
I think it's important. I mean, a life cycle event, and we talked about this when we came down to meet a couple weeks ago, is a broad concept that I think we need to maybe parse out a little bit. Any trade has a number of events during its life. Typically an interest rate swap will have many resets over the life of the trade. Those are events that are fully anticipated in the terms of the transaction when the transaction is done. And I don't know that, that you don't need to, I don't think, update for the LIBOR fixing every quarter because that's out in the marketplace, widely available. Anybody can, apply that. There are, on the other hand, and this is particularly true in the credit derivative space, somewhat true in other product areas, there are those events that really go to the very core fundamental nature of the transaction. Does it exist? Does it exist in the same form that it existed before that event? So the credit events, which actually lead to a termination and settlement of the trade, a succession event, which leads to a change in the underlying reference entity identity, and there are a few other things that might occur. In other product areas, you may have force majeure type events, which will lead often to a termination, maybe to a different pricing reference for a trade, those types of events. Those are probably more going to the core fundamental nature of the trade, as opposed to the ordinary course events that are anticipated in the original terms of the trade. And I think it's important to distinguish between those two, because otherwise you'll be getting, tens of thousands of resets on a weekly basis that come in just by virtue of the number of interest rate swaps that are out there, resetting to whatever the LIBOR rate is today.
So there is a related point, and it's interesting because the resets, I think, at a level are too granular, but there's a point that any fixing in a transaction has some implication to its valuation. So something that's been determined in the past has a valuation impact, and so that is a piece of data that is required to value a transaction. So again, the valuation model, the mark-to-market discussion in terms of the data, whether that needs to be independently sourced or is provided by the participants, may determine some of those requirements at a detailed level. But I agree absolutely that they're not the events that are the traded events that are really subject to some of the surveillance activities. But I think to really answer the detailed question about some of the real granular data fields, you have to answer some of the questions about how you might source valuations for products.
I think it goes back a little bit to the contrast between the listed markets and the OTC swap market. And in the OTC swap market, we have as we've seen, lower turnover of new trades, but we have trades that last a lot longer in terms of years or decades. And we can see that, in the AIG crisis, those trades have been around for some time. They weren't recently put on. They'd been around for years. And so, potentially the issue across the whole landscape of post-trade events is one that needs to be fully covered by anything monitoring systemic risk. And in our experience, providing exposure management is that it's challenging to enumerate exhaustively all the potential post-trade events that could happen, especially on the more complex trades that are out there, and the way in which, for the purposes of exposure management on the firm and party level, we have worked with that is by having the parties resubmit. Because the trades come from an automated source, it's relatively cheap and easy to resubmit the population from the core books and records of the firms on a regular basis, and that way obviates the need to exhaustively enumerate all potential events that you need to be notified of.
From the one of the things to note, just to add, I think Bob raised a very good point about what is an event, and it's important to define that. Some of the things to note are things like resets, things like credit event processing. Within a cleared world is actually important to be internalized within the CCP. It cannot be external to it. It has to be internal. Because we are the guaranteeing process and we are managing the risk. But in an uncleared world, of course, it's very important. I mean, the whatever services are provided by external private parties are for a private benefit, which is essentially resolving the events in a normal manner. So if you needed the information, you could always find the information you wanted. If the events are essentially transfer of trades or transfer of ownership, for a regulated market or for a cleared market regulated by a regulator, we do provide that information. I think you would require the same thing for a swap data repository.
Let me pose a slightly different question. There are various parts of Dodd-Frank that talk about which party should report depending on the status of the parties. You know, if you have a swap dealer and the other party is not a swap dealer, the swap dealer reports, and there's a sort of priority system. Some of our, I won't say we have experts in swaps, but people who know a little more than some of us began with, and some of our data people are telling me that there might be lots of advantages to having both parties report, either with respect to initial, data at the time of the initial transaction or life cycle data. And I'd like to ask, I mean, here we have, counterparties and repositories. What would be the advantages and disadvantages of having one party take on the reporting obligation versus getting reports from both parties?
I'll take a crack at that one. I think that first, I think almost all of these questions need to be broken down into the answer, which is the best answer for the purpose of SDRs in terms of big picture aggregate oversight, especially for systemic risk purposes, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the answer which is best for the purposes of the real-time post-trade price transparency mandate. So I'm not sure where the notion that that two people submitting independently might be useful comes from, but if I were to guess, one thing I would imagine is that people might say, if your objective, if you take trace for corporate bonds as an example, which obviously the SEC is quite familiar with, by virtue of the fact that both sides have the obligation to report, whoever reports sooner creates your kind of, well, that must have been the latest that the trade was done, and therefore if the other person reports substantially later than that, then that establishes that that person has reported late. So I think that's one argument I can see in favor of independent reporting for the purposes of that requirement. I think for all other purposes, I think independent reporting carries a significant risk of essentially duplicating a version of the process that the DTCC does that Stuart is quite familiar with, which is the kind of double-blind matching confirmation model, which is frankly really painful. Because almost invariably the information that gets reported is very rich. Some subset of it is information that people sort of don't really care about very much and don't keep sufficiently precise records in. As a result, you get a lot of spurious breaks in the independent submissions, which are of really no significance for regulatory purposes. So I guess I would refer back to my earlier comments, which is it would be really much more efficient if people were allowed to satisfy the requirement by essentially outsourcing the submission to a middleware provider. And from the perspective of dealing with the timeliness issue, you obviously wouldn't want to create a situation where people could avoid the requirement to do post-trade public reporting in a timely fashion by sort of nefariously conspiring to not affirm the trade soon after it was done. that's easily addressable since those services nonetheless require each party to interact with it independently, that if one of the two parties hadn't engaged within the time window, then you would get single-sided submission for post-trade transparency purposes.
And I think on that last point, it's likely that business conduct standards are going to come down on people who don't report it in a timely fashion anyway.
So the thing, we value from the idea of both parties being involved is this quality control, but the statement that can come in matched or affirmed if that's the model of one party submits it, another party attests to that, and that comes down as a match trade, or it comes from something higher up that's a CEF that again is pre-matched. To us that is the highest quality data that we can receive, and we think that is very valuable. How that then ties to the construct within Dodd-Frank of who's reported that, I'm not sure, but there's huge value, and there's huge value of having participants in the system in terms of identifying who they are. And dealing with some of the data privacy issues. And again, if you're going to operate this globally and you care about things that impact your markets that are outside, again, the United States, you will need provisions like that to aggregate all that data, because you will hit data privacy concerns that can only be dealt with by contracting with some of the parties, and some of them can't be dealt with. This is the second advantage over and above data quality is potentially the data completeness.
Excuse me. The important part for us again is that users is satisfying the reporting obligations, and so therefore I would sort of again recommend that if we've used an outsourced provider, we've talked about separate outside confirmation processes as well. It would be nice from an end user perspective to say okay, that lot is then reported, and we've got documentation and process behind it. So again, to me, to have that process go on, which is a useful business process, and then to duplicate it again in some other fashion is just an additional cost. May not be just continually adding to the cost, and to the quality of the total reporting burden has been satisfied. Some compliance officer or risk manager has to ultimately say, we've satisfied our reporting obligations, and here's our checklist, and here's how we've gone about it. So,
as a software solution provider, obviously, it's beneficial to get two records that you can match together. You can, from the software point of view, do more verification. And for example, the counterparty standardization that we talked about, it's easier if you're getting both sides of the trade to make that mapping and translation. But to Jeremy's point, this is very much focused at the sort of systemic risk end of the function of the repository rather than the real-time reporting.
I've also experienced the MiFID regime, not in the current role I'm in, but in Europe, and we found it difficult to control that process as a party submitting to that, simply because there wasn't a feedback loop from it. And so, talking to the using existing mechanisms that have, in effect, feedback loops. So if you don't confirm to your counterparty will provide you the feedback. Whereas typically under MiFID, if you omit to report, you omit to report, and you may or may not find out about that later. But it's very difficult to audit and control that standalone reporting process. And I actually think maybe 3 times I found myself doing a full review of our MiFID reporting at various times in a kind of like former life. So it's difficult.
I think you want to get those two strands to come together. With all the information you're going to provide, all the other things you need to do. I would think that this is one area where you can probably leverage off of what's been built in the industry, where there are those platforms where people come together, whether it be CEFs or some of the providers around the table, and take that information and then not have to take that burden on among the many ones you're taking on.
Moving on to the next questions.
I guess following up on some comments that have been discussed already, but just generally, I think somebody had made the comment about providing flexibility for the repositories to take in data in various different formats, maybe just to get some more thoughts on the practicalities of that, given sort of where the industry is today, and then sort of is there the ability to take the data in all different formats and sort of, I don't know the correct term, but standardizing, right, map it in terms of being able to look across the various, all of the information coming in to standardize it?
I guess here again, similar to my last point, there are these factories, these processing bits, whether it's Trioptima or DTCC or the CEFs that are taking some of this information in and producing some output. And I think you should be most focused on what the output from those processes are, and largely leave it up to the infrastructure to build something that they think is effective to produce the output you need. Again, I can talk about financial products markup language, which is one possible means of that output. But again, it's these infrastructure components that have put a lot of work and effort into being able to be responsive to their clients and taking in information in whatever format the clients may have. That may evolve with FPML over time, which is a pretty rich standard, but we know that there are platforms that utilize information in other formats.
I think fundamentally in the OTC swap landscape, there are going to be some contracts out there where it's going to be frankly subjective as to how to submit them, and that's just a reality that the comprehensive nature of the SDR faces. I think from our experience, providing exposure management, we do what we call normalization, whereby we allow the parties to submit in a format that has certain rules about it, but as free as possible, so that we can get data from their automated services and leverage these other platforms. But truthfully, a great part of what allows us to make that work is the fact that we're seeing both sides of the trade, and that it's kind of like the Rosetta Stone. You get it in another language and you can work out what the translation is. And so to a degree, it's based on that, but it does allow the parties to use their existing automated systems and not have to build to new prescribed formats, which is costly and needs maintaining going forward.
I think I'm hearing an answer to that question, but let me just confirm that I am. If the rules contemplated a setup where we did not prescribe to the counterparties what data standard or what language they should be using to report to the SDRs, if all we said was the regulators want to get from the SDRs using this data standard, is that most workable for everyone? I think I'm hearing the answer to that is yes, but
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, but I think that SDRs should be, I would think the SDR should be permitted, if it winds up being most efficient, to require that the submissions to them be in a certain format. In other words, there's kind of three choices, right? One is regulator says when you submit to the SDR, it must be in this format. That sounds like a bad idea. Next option is SDR can sort of consult with its constituencies and agree a format. That seems pretty reasonable to me. Third option is SDR is forbidden from prescribing a format to its constituency. That seems like it's requiring a degree of flexibility on the part of the SDR, which may not be economically in the interest of the community at large. It may be sort of satisfying one particular party's desire to submit a certain format, and that expense is going to wind up being shared among everyone, I think, for very little collective benefit.
we touched on this question before, but again, as a follow-up, various pieces of our discussion here have talked about, the utility, for instance, of letting counterparties satisfy their reporting obligation through using a third-party confirmation service that, then would report to the SDR. point taken on that one. You carry that a little further. We raised the question earlier, and I don't think entirely answered it. Should only confirmed trades come into the SDR? And this obviously, there's a time aspect to this, and the time aspect is probably most urgent, if you like. The more bespoke the transaction is, I mean, something that's executed on a platform or cleared, that data will come quickly. In any case, it may come less quickly, if it's truly bilateral OTC and some confirmation has to be done. What are the ups and downs of should only confirmed trades come into the SDR?
So I think non-confirmed trade should come in, and again we talked about this quality standard. The reason I think they should is because they're information, and they could be very material information to the picture that the SDR presents with respect to trading positions. Now there might have to be a caveat associated with that record to say that it isn't as secure as others. Now, again, the problem is this then becomes an opening of the confirmation process to the SDR, and there is noise in that confirmation process. There's messages that are sent that were sent in error. They weren't, they need to be amended, and there needs to be some ability to cut out that noise. But I think at a certain point in time, the SDR should take unconfirmed trades, if it's coming from a confirmed platform, into the SDR and have that information available to report, because potentially that single trade could be material to the information given.
But does it mean that you will also have to have some system of error resolution after confirmation finally arrives to you?
You would be able to cancel any erroneous message.
Do you have this type of systems? Do you have experience in dealing with that?
So today that happens. That happens. We have access to unconfirmed trades as well as confirmed trades, and we can report on that, and we have an audit trail and cancel and correct methodology that can work. But I do want to caution that I don't think where transactions where clearly they were quickly corrected, I'm not sure they should all be washed through entirely. So again, it will point to the timeliness point towards the SDR. The real-time situation will need a different model than that, but the core reporting of an SDR, I think, should be informed potentially by unconfirmed events to allow accurate data.
I might just ask a question of both Stuart and David. By unconfirmed trades, I mean there are the trades with the DTC warehouse. There are the trades that are actually confirmed through the system and go in as the so-called gold copy. There are other trades that go in there that are not those types of trades, but they are nevertheless a confirmation exists of those trades. And I think you're probably aware, with the efforts made by the industry over the last 5 years working with the New York Fed, the time between execution and the confirmation has been drastically reduced across certainly credit, interest rates, and even in other areas, so that the number of trades for which a confirmation, meaning both parties have signed off on the confirmation, doesn't exist is a relatively small number. And I guess my own personal reaction, I haven't sounded out the membership on this, is that better to wait that extra day or two to get a properly, fully confirmed trade available to go into the warehouse than to take in information today that might need to be corrected the next day and the next day before it's finally confirmed. But that's just my reaction. That's distinct from the confirmed trades that go in, which are in your case very rich in information.
And I take it part of your point is that any downside in timeliness or delay has in a sense already been minimized because the majority of trades are being confirmed quickly anyway.
Well, that's right, and furthermore, again, distinguishing using the Barnum distinction, if you will, between the trade information, about the pricing, the real-time price reporting, versus the information about systemic risk. I mean, keep in mind, AIG did not put those trades on over the course of 3 days. They put them on over the course of several years, and the risk built up. So you'll be able to see that build up in risk.
Just one very brief thing, I'm not sure if a question is going to be asked that's going to allow us to address, and I actually think it's quite critical, which is that it is important for the regulators to engage with the SDRs and the various providers, especially in connection with post-trade transparency, but also generally on the question of price forming versus non-price forming trades, and the related question of like events which are trades and events which are not trades. And we're not going to have time to discuss that in detail here, but I think that those two questions are ones that we as an industry have struggled with quite a bit, and I think people like Stuart are sadly for him, intimately familiar with the challenges that they create. But I think from the perspective of avoiding a signal-to-noise ratio problem in the regulatory community, especially in connection with surveillance, it's going to be very important to think carefully about that question and ensure that the standards that emerge include this kind of attribute, which is price forming, non-price forming, and a post-trade event which is actually the same economically as a trade, like for example an unwind or a partial unwind, versus post-trade event which is not a trade, like for example an amendment of a fee that was booked erroneously.
And Bob, just a quick question. You had mentioned you thought the majority of the deals are confirmed quickly, just like in a time frame. What did you mean by that?
I don't have, I could get you the statistics that are reported on a regular basis to the regulators, but in,
Actually, Bob, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I just happened to have an answer to that question. I think the guys, Stuart, you may have this as well, but some work was done to look at the question in rates of what was the time lag between submission and confirmation with people using the I guess, whatever you want to call it, the SwapsWire workflow and rates. And apparently the average time from execution to confirmation was something like 11 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, we can get a lot of deep information and data to you on that from the efforts over the last 5 years with the New York Fed.
I don't want to answer that specific question, but going back to the earlier point, I think if you get data, then you need to be able to get corrections. That's just the reality. We get 6 million trades on a regular basis and over 4 million a day, and you just got to be able to handle corrections, and you've got to be able to handle lots of them. So that's a separate requirement, I think, on the repository. So, and if you want confirmations, there's lots of good initiatives that have happened around speeding up confirmations, and we've heard about the benefits of that. But from our experience of exposure management, parties want to get on with that task independently of how the confirmation is proceeding. It may be already done, it may not be already done, but we wouldn't see the benefit in making submission to a repository dependent on confirmation having already happened.
We're nearing the end, just a couple of minutes left, so if anyone has any other final comments or observations to make?
I think there's a distinction between affirmation and confirmation. There is electronic affirmation taking place. In some clearing models, such as ours, we don't require a legal confirmation before the trade is submitted for clearing, especially if it's a new trade. So we need electronic affirmation, and then the legal confirmation is the one that is disseminated by the clearinghouse. So it's very important to distinguish the two. An affirmation is bringing two people together, and you can actually have a match in that case on all circumstances. For bilateral trades, there is an extra step of confirmation, which actually does the legal document enforcement.
Is that, excuse me,
I would just briefly like to chime in there.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm of the opinion, it's a bit of a personal one, but that the distinction between affirmation and confirmation is to some degree a distinction without a difference. And so I think that, it's actually an important question for the regulatory community to think about, because I wonder whether this has ever been tested, but in practical terms as a legal matter, if we're saying that affirmation effectively represents full de facto agreement between the parties, then the distinction between that and confirmation becomes moot, and there's an argument that we shouldn't be building a lot of infrastructure that presumes the existence of two distinct processes.
Can I just ask a sort of a wrap-up question, which is, how long will this take? I know you may be reluctant to answer that because you might think we're going to cut whatever number you give us in half. But maybe to avoid kind of getting into numbers, we've been hearing a lot about existing systems off of which we can leverage, and I think that's been very helpful to think along those lines. But if you have a view about implementation time frame, that would be helpful. But also, if you have a view about what we could do to resolve some of the issues that will facilitate quicker implementation. In other words, I know a lot of this will be, the answer is, well, it depends on what how long will it take? It depends on what the system looks like. So are there basic design elements of the system that would be helpful to address sooner rather than later, even if all the details aren't worked out, to help facilitate your planning and the more speedy implementation?
Just try to be brief.
Take a stab at it. And the first one would be what do you need and when do you need it by? And the second comment would be what's readily available. So if it's readily available, then that makes it a lot more straightforward. And then the discussion can be about how and when that gets delivered. When we get into the green fields of trying to understand what's next and what's new, I think we need to be very cautious and probably take our time and, crawl, then walk, then run. But I think that if you look at the legacy of systems and the legacy of work that's been done in the industry, there's certainly some answers available there in the shorter term. But I think if we attempt to boil the ocean and look at everything, it'll take forever, and we won't end up where we want to be.
I think the important question is scope of the SDR. What is the true scope? And the second would be how does a regulated market or cleared world play along with that?
Real quick then, I think there's two parts of it. One is, as a provider, what requirements you're putting on us as a solution provider. And secondly, from the industry point of view, the respondents, what they need to do in order to get ready to meet those, really. And I think you probably want to get the provider to make it easy for the respondent.
I guess I'd point to a little bit of recent experience, namely the process that's been going on over the last 5 years with the New York Fed, where, and I'm not suggesting it's 5 years as the answer, but I mean, that's been a very effective collaborative effort between the industry, broadly speaking, and global regulators. And if you look at where we were in September of 2005 versus where we are in September of 2010, you'll see just a completely different world. And so I think there is some hope that this can move along very quickly with a commitment across the industry and working very collaboratively with the regulators.
Yeah, the elapsed time to load the warehouse was about a year, and it was a fairly concerted effort, fairly managed by a group of external consultants, and obviously like with a lot of resources from the participants themselves. So that was a pretty that's one asset class. That was trying to get it to a high quality data set that they could say was their official legal records of those trades. That was a practical experience. The level setting the expectations of the requirements, I think, is the key, right? Because I think as a service provider, people have different perceptions about where we're trying to get to. So I think that's absolutely key. And then there is some tensions about what the right solutions are and which components to use and reuse. And I think it's important that we don't throw away what already exists, and we do build from that. So those are the points from me.
Any other
I would say, my answer to the question would be, one, apply an 80-20 rule, do the easy stuff first, so that there'll be, even with the easy stuff, there will be lessons to be learned, which will then make the difficult stuff less difficult, and it will allow significant progress to be made on the easy stuff, which I think will be helpful for everyone. And the second point I would say is that to facilitate speed, an early decision, I would argue should be made to create a construct that allows private sector solutions to meet the requirements, so that people feel like they have commercial incentives to pursue solutions. That will speed things up much more than if everyone's waiting around to be told what to do.
With that, thank you very much. I'm going to thank all the panelists for participating today. We're going to take a 1-hour break. We'll start back here on panel 3 at 1:45. Thanks again, everyone.
I get so lost sometimes. Days pass and this emptiness fills my heart. When I want to run away, I drive off in my car. But whichever